Time to start day 3 of this public inquiry. For anyone not present in previous sessions, I'll run through some of the opening introduction that I gave on day 1. Apologies for any repetition for those who have been present. My name is David Bouillier. I'm a reporter within the Scottish Government's Planning and Environmental Appeals Division, or DPEA. I've been appointed by Scottish ministers to conduct this inquiry and to report to them my findings and recommendation. Inquiry concerns an application by Scottish Hydroelectric Transmission plc for consent under Section 37 of the Electricity Act 1989 and deemed planning permission to install and keep installed a 13.3 kilometre double circuit 275 kilovolt overhead line from a proposed substation at Craigdhu to the existing Scottish Power Energy Networks 275 kV overhead line that runs from Dalmally to Inverarnan. DPA will be filming these sessions. We try to ensure public seating areas are not filmed. However, if you attend a public inquiry session in person, we cannot guarantee that the image will not be recorded. Recordings are available on our video publication site for 12 weeks from the date of the final decision. If you search for DPEA TV, you will find the site. In accordance with the Code of Practice for handling inquiries under the Electricity Act and in the interests of fairness, only those who've registered to participate in the hearing sessions will be permitted to participate in the discussion. Contributions from elsewhere in the room will not be possible. We'll have a mid-morning and mid-afternoon break, usually around 11:30 and 3:30. Lunch will be around 1 o'clock for an hour. I've had to think about the conditions. I'm satisfied, unless anyone's changed their mind, that we won't need a session tomorrow morning to consider planning conditions. So that being the case, the next and final session will be tomorrow evening, starting at 7 p.m. in this room. And that's the opportunity for those local residents who've registered to speak, to come and tell me about their views and concerns, and also for Mr. Campbell to arrange that video that I'm looking forward to seeing. I'm not encouraging any such applications, but if any party was minded to make an application for an award of expenses, it would seem appropriate that notice of that, or indeed any other sort of legal submissions or procedural questions, was given before the close of today's session, rather than intruding upon tomorrow evening, which I want to remain focused on the views of local people. So any kind of practical, technical, legal issues, sort them out today if possible. Before I ask who's registered their intention to participate in today's discussion, I need to give the usual request that mobile devices are on silent, and to reiterate the importance of using the microphone and also trying to project one's voice. I understand audibility is still not great at the back of the room. It's a difficult shape of room, and I'm aware it's not really natural when we're supposed to be having a roundtable discussion to be projecting, but if you can try to do that, it also helps the recording software to pick up what everyone has said, which makes my job a lot easier as well. I don't have to take so many notes. Final usual reminder, fire exits either the way you came in or through the door to my left. I think that was it on housekeeping. As I say, today's discussion will be about the question of alternatives to the submitted proposal. I'll explain a little bit, very briefly, about how we'll be doing that. But first, I think it's probably wise or appropriate time to ask those who will be participating to introduce themselves, starting with the applicants team, please.
Good morning, sir. My name is Marcus Mackay. I'm a King's Counsel at the Scottish Bar, and I'm appearing alongside my Leonard Junior Nick McAndrew, who's an advocate, also at the Scottish Bar. The two primary witnesses on this topic are the authors of the Alternatives topic paper, namely Russell Stewart, who's a Regional Development Project Manager with SSEN Transmission, and Peter Bruce, who's an Environmental Consultant and Principal at Ramboll. There are other members of the team available to assist if need be, sir.
Thank you very much. And no more pylons?
Sir, good morning. I'm John Campbell, King's Counsel at the Scottish Bar. I'm appearing with no more pylons, instructed by solicitors. I'm accompanied today by Dr. Chris Ford, who's sitting to my right, and Ms. Sue Rawcliffe, who is sitting to my left. Ms. Susie Anderson is sitting also to my right from the Community Council, if she's required. And Ms. Kelda Platt is on screen. I wonder if I can check with my friend opposite if he can see the screen. There's quite a lot of reflection from the roof. Can you see the screen all right? Yeah. Thank you very much.
And the Council, I know, are not participating. You're just here to observe.
That's correct, sir. The council is only here to observe today.
Thank you. Nobody else I've forgotten who's registered to participate? Nope. Excellent. Before I crack on, were there any preliminary matters that arose overnight that anyone wants to raise? Mr. Campbell? No. 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 Excellent. Excellent. Okay, item 1B on the agenda. As I said, I'll briefly explain for the benefit of anyone less familiar with the hearing session what we'll be doing. It's a roundtable discussion led by me. I have a series of questions that I will probably direct at one particular participant in the first instance, but I'd welcome input from anyone who's around the table. Other parties may have other questions, better questions sometimes, and I'm quite happy to hear those, preferably directed through me, just so I can make sure that they're relevant, fair, etc. No cross-examination, obviously. Just because something's on the agenda doesn't mean I don't think it's important. I may just simply have missed it, or it may be that I think I have enough information, but don't feel you can't raise something just because it's not on the agenda, so long as it falls within the remit of the title. And if my line of questioning appears to indicate I've already made my mind up on a topic, please be sure that is not the case. I'm just trying to challenge the evidence that's before me. Any questions on the procedure? We all know what we're doing. Excellent. Okay, moving on to item 2, where I'll relatively briefly summarise my understanding of the parties' cases. The idea is that those who are watching, who may be less familiar with all the written documents, get a summary of what the different parties' approach to the topic in question is, and hopefully enables the parties to be reassured that I understand what it is that they're saying. Obviously, if there's anything I've missed out or anything I've got wrong, please do tell me. That's what it's here for. So I'll start with the applicant. The applicant's approach to this project was shaped by the statutory framework within which it operates. Under Section 9 of the Electricity Act, the applicant, as a transmission owner, has a duty to develop and maintain an efficient, coordinated and economical system of electricity transmission. The applicant is also required by Schedule 9 to have regard to the durability, the natural beauty, of conserving flora, fauna and geological or physiographical features of special interest, and of protecting sites, buildings and objects of architectural, historic or archaeological interest, and to do what he reasonably can to mitigate any effect on any such flora, fauna, features, sites, buildings or objects. These two provisions require a balance to be taken. It would be illogical for Scottish ministers to expect a transmission owner to adhere to its duties of efficiency and economy, but nonetheless expect it to deliver economically disproportionate steps in order to mitigate environmental issues. Such an approach would lead to a scheme that would not be likely to receive approval for funding by Ofgem. When deciding on a route, the applicant has to strike the correct balance between cost, technical considerations and the mitigation of environmental issues. Health and safety risks to staff must also be minimised. This is a highly complex process, and the applicant employs its routing guidance to ensure consistent weighing of the various considerations using a red, amber and green rating. The cost of undergrounding cables mean it can only be justified in certain limited circumstances, either technical or environmental, and even where justified, such an approach does not lead to an absence of effects, as an underground cable needs to have a development-free corridor even after construction is complete. Therefore, it does not avoid tree felling or habitat disturbance. Ceiling end platforms are also required, which themselves have an above-ground effect. In the case of this proposal, the applicant did give detailed and appropriate consideration to a range of options, including undergrounding. After local opposition to its original proposal to route the line towards Dalmally, the feasibility of undergrounding part of that route was considered on 2 occasions. Due to flood risk, deep peat, likely construction difficulties and the sterilisation of forestry land, undergrounding was ruled out. However, rather than pursuing the original route, the applicant responded to community concerns by developing an alternative route that was away from Dalmally. The applicant believes this route responds to the concerns raised insofar as is possible while remaining economic, efficient and coordinated. The applicant does not consider any of the supposed alternatives put forward by No More Pylons to be valid. It rejects alternative 5, the subsea cable link from Kintyre to Hunterston, as it would not provide the required additional capacity. Options 1 to 4 were assessed against the applicant's routing guidance. All were found to have serious constraints ranging from health and safety concerns and construction difficulties to significant impacts on nationally important landscapes or ecological designations. And even if they had not, their greater costs of construction and operation would make them irreconcilable with the applicant's duty to maintain an economic and efficient transmission system. Does that just about cover it, do you think?
Thank you, sir. That's a fair summary. Thank you.
Turning to the case for no more pylons, NMP notes that the applicant considered alternatives at two stages. In its INC submission to Ofgem and in the EIA report. At the INC stage, 4 main options were considered: the application proposal, a direct connection between Inverarnan and Inverarnan substations, a subsea cable from Crossegg to Hunterston, and subsea cables from Carradale to the Ayrshire coast. The subsea cables were never specified with sufficient capacity, so were never properly considered by the applicant, and environmental benefits of a subsea cable were not properly weighed in the balance. The option of a direct link between Inverarnan and Inverarnan substations was ruled out due to anticipated opposition from the National Park Authority, which NNP does not believe was appropriately tested. It notes that there are already overhead lines within the National Park, and not all of the National Park has National Scenic Area status. No consideration was given to undergrounding those parts of the Inverarnan to Inverarnan option that were within the National Park. NNP believes that due to the applicant's flawed approach, the current proposal was effectively the only option that was considered at the INC stage, and it is critical of the applicant for not having referred to the Holford rules within that INC process. At the EIA report stage, one option was ruled out due to residential and general visual amenity effects, another due to engineering challenges. This left the application proposal and an alternative that would have involved a switching station rather than a tie-in to the Scottish Power overhead line. As the latter would have been more expensive, the application proposal was considered to be preferred. NMP believes there was a gap between the INC stage regional level assessment and the EIA local level consideration of alternatives. The proposal is reliant upon the proposed Craigdhu to Inverary line, but no alternatives to that section were considered. NMP also believes it is clearly possible to underground the whole of the current proposal. Therefore, the applicant's failure to assess that reasonable alternative is contrary to NPF4 expectations. NMP has suggested several alternatives and has set out a comparison of the environmental implications of each. Its analysis shows all would have a substantially lower level of visibility. All except alternative 1 would have reduced visibility from road and rail lines and thus inhabited areas than the applicant's proposal. Undergrounding of particularly sensitive sections of NNP's alternatives could remove or substantially reduce effects on the national park. Alternative 1 would be only slightly more visible than the applicant's proposal from roads and less visible from elsewhere. Alternative 2 would utilise areas with very low levels of habitation. While they might be considered to affect wild, remote areas, there is already extensive intrusion from the Lochy hydropower scheme. Alternative 3 would offer the lowest area of visibility substantially below the application proposal, particularly in terms of visibility from main roads and rail lines. The intensity of the visual effect would be an order of magnitude below the application proposal. Alternative 4 would use or replace existing overhead line routes, so would not introduce such infrastructure into areas where it is not already a feature. As such, it too would have lesser visual effects than the applicant's proposal. While it would pass through a national park, prudent undergrounding could be employed, as the applicant is doing to mitigate the effects of existing cables. Alternative 5, being subsea, would avoid all landscape and visual effects. Anything I've missed, Dr. Ford or Ms. Platt? Ms. Platt, are you content with that summary?
Yes, I'm happy with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, if we move to item 3 on the agenda, topics for discussion, I broke it down to 2 areas, really. We'll look at how the applicant considered alternatives and the NNP criticisms of that approach. And then in the second half, we'll be looking at the alternatives that NNP has put forward and the applicant's reasons for rejecting those. So in the first section, I think most of my questions initially will be directed at Dr. Ford, but Ms. Platt, you should also jump in if you think you had an input or you want to say something about any of those questions. But I'll be using, I think, Dr. Ford's statement as the basis because that's kind of mostly where it's set out. while I'll be initially directing questions at Dr. Ford, the applicant, obviously feel free to chip in your own comments at any point. I think if we all get Dr. Ford's statement up, because I'm bound to be referring to that as we go through. Right. There's a few questions I suspect where you may be in agreement with me, but I'll check. Feel free to disagree, obviously. Obviously, you've got a very impressive CV, Dr. Ford, but I'm right, I think, in saying you've not been professionally involved in route selection process in your career.
Only from this position, in terms of being an objector. I've been involved with another case, a Section 37 case, where actually we looked at different alternatives and we questioned, if you like, in the same way that's going on here, questioned the proposals put forward. But it's not my engineering responsibility now.
No, I appreciate that. I suspect you probably agree with the applicant's description of the process as complex, time-consuming and highly specialised. Is that fair?
Yes, it is. I don't feel it's something that I do not understand, if you like, and not familiar with. The challenge is the engineering challenge of designing the line, the environmental challenge of minimising the environmental effects, and obviously the overriding cost priority. The engineering of it is sometimes made to be complex and appears quite complex, but actually some of it is quite simplistic. And I don't want to in any way underestimate the skill set that's behind the application and obviously with the applicant. But essentially, having established what the capacity requirement is, they can, if you like, off the shelf, work out what the voltage requirement is. And they are, I don't want to understate this, but it's not that complex. Essentially, they will be working out the capacity of the conductors. That'll give them a weight, if you like, and the specification of the conductors. And from that, given it's a double circuit and the kind of calculations of the three phases that are involved with it and the earthing circuit across the top, they will be able to work out the pylons that are required. There's a suite of, I think these days it's about half a dozen, but maybe up to a dozen core types of pylons. And they come from a specification that is really a national specification now, I think provided by the Energy Networks Association. And that's about carrying the weight of the conductors, given the general separation, which is typically 300 metres. So that'll give them the size of the pylon types that they're going to use. Their primary obligation in terms of the safety here is to minimise the ground clearance from the overhead line at its lowest point between the pylons. That's a specification they have to take into account. And obviously they've got to take into account that if you like, the summer and the winter variations of that, because the lines actually expand and contract according to heat, according to the temperature, basically. And there are things like variations to the pylons that they're putting in, so that, for example, a straight line of pylons is carrying the weight, if you like, in alignment, but where the line turns, they need to change the configuration of the pylons. And obviously, there are foundations that need to be put in. They also come to take account of the weight of the pylons, the weight of the conductors, the weight of the isolators, and most particularly here, the ground conditions. So that's the kind of engineering points that they're taking into account. They obviously need access, so they need to be able to put in an access track. They will need to take account of slopes and other things like that. So what you see is that on the high points they tend to have, they can take the height to the minimum height of pylons, and in the low points, if they're between gullies, for example, they'll be putting higher pylons. So my feeling is that it's certainly not something I've ever done, and obviously these guys have the capability and responsibility to do it kind of thing. There's no sense of questioning their professional expertise here. But I don't believe it's that complex at the end of the day. Thank you.
I don't think you're suggesting that they haven't taken all of those considerations into account, that they've informed the route that they've taken. Yeah. Did you want to come back on that?
Yes, so with respect to Dr. Ford, I don't think that was a very straightforward answer to your question, which related to his expertise or purported expertise in this area. What I would be interested to know, and the applicant would be interested to know, is whether, when preparing his hearing statement, Dr. Ford was aware and had considered the detailed routing guidance which is lodged as a document, there are various iterations of that document, prepared by SSEN. In that respect, why he instead refers to the Halford rules, which were published in 1959, with adjustments made in 1992. Was he even aware of the SSEN guidance, and if he was, why doesn't he refer to it?
Yeah, I was coming to that. Good question, Dr. Ford. You refer to Halford rules. Why not the later routing guidance, which appears to incorporate that?
I'm aware of the guidance. It's very similar guidance to that's also used by other transmission owners. So National Grid and SPEN have very similar guidance, actually. The Halford rules have obviously been in place since 1959. In other cases I've seen the applicant explicitly referring to the Halford rules. I appreciate at this stage the applicant has put them, if you like, back into the guidance stage rather than demonstrating that they've applied them in the proposal stage. And the reason why I feel that there's a value in taking into account the Halford rules at this stage, if you like, within the application stage rather than just as a background, is that they are key guidance from UK government and from the regulators about the way in which overhead lines should be designed and developed. There is some valid criticism of the Halford rules because it's long in the tooth now. But what's surprising is that since 1959 it has stood the test of time. The other thing why, if you like, I have a professional interest in suggesting that Halford ought to be taken into account is that fundamentally he's a very eminent town planner. And this is something that is sometimes not really understood. But this is ultimately, if you like, I know we're dealing with the Electricity Act and I know we're dealing with other parts of the regulations, but this is essentially a planning decision. And therefore, using the guidance that's given by an eminent town planner, let's just consider his eminence, he basically wrote the modern statutes that we have. He was the principal technical officer during the Second World War that wrote the what became the 47 Act, the first major modern town planning act. So his role is probably, to be frank, we can discuss other eminent planners, but in terms of modern planning practice, he's probably the father of it. And the fact that he's applied himself to things like overhead lines, and I have to say, good wisdom by the part of the CEGB in its generation, in terms of bringing in a planning thinking into the design and development and routing choices around overhead lines. And some of the other things that he also said. I mean, I've not presented any evidence about what he said at the time when he presented his rules. They're relatively crisp rules within a speech he gave at the Royal Academy. But he also laid out some other general principles about trying to keep generation close to demand, because essentially you finish up with the kind of proposition that we were looking at yesterday, with requiring less lines. So from that point of view, maybe it's just a professional interest, but I do think Halford's got a relevance to the case and needs to be appropriately considered.
It certainly does, and I'll be coming back to Halford in terms of looking at alternatives and the like. But you may want to say something else. I do want to hear from your side. I think Dr. Ford is saying, yes, it's difficult, but it's not rocket science, or I don't know. crude about it, but that effectively, I think, is what you're saying. It's not that difficult. I wondered if your experts had a view on that.
Yes, thank you, sir. If I can bring in Mr. Bruce at this point, and by reference to the relevant documents, I think he can establish just how out of touch Dr. Ford is on this issue.
Thank you, sir. So just firstly to the point of complexity, I think one of the points that I feel is perhaps being overlooked by Dr. Ford is that a large part of the complexity is in the balancing of the various issues, and that's something that NMP haven't really sought to do, I think we would say. In terms of the Holford rules, they are clearly embedded into SSAN's guidance. The guidance in force, or that we worked to at the start of the project, the 2004 guidelines, it's really up front and centre, and we can take you to that reference, which is App 310. The latest guidelines, App 312, you can see in section 2.2 of that document the reference to Holford rules, and the explanation that really that they were that we sought to update the 2004 guidance, working with the SSAN to take account of contemporary practice. You can then move to the appendix to that same document and see where Holford is referenced, page 47 of that document. And that's one of many factors that go into the routing considerations. Yeah, and if you, for reference in terms of the first point we came out to consult with the community 2016-2017, the consultation document CD 10.3, you'll see numerous references to how the Holford rules played into the consideration of alternative routes throughout the document.
A quick question, or really a point. Has the applicant lodged the Holford rules?
Yes, they are an appendix to the guidance document itself. And I believe NMP have lodged them themselves as well. Yeah.
We have, yes. A response on the general points. In terms of balance, I agree with you. The complexities of the three issues, the economic, the environmental and the engineering, I agree with you. The issues here are about striking the balance. In terms of us and our alternatives, we have not sought to replace the applicant in terms of presenting a proposal. We don't pretend to do that. We don't have the capability, we don't have the resources that you have. So I think the idea that we can, if you like, achieve your level of depth of analysis is fair criticism. I accept that. But nevertheless, we are in a position, given our expertise, landscape and planning and so on, and I include economics amongst my skill set as well. So overall, I think we're in a position to judge the balance. I accept in your rebuttal, for example, you get into engineering issues and things like that, and we haven't, despite the fact my doctorate is actually in engineering. I haven't sought to get into details because, frankly, that is beyond my expertise. Although my personal position is that actually I come from an engineering school where we seek to resolve challenges as opposed to put them as hurdles that can't be overcome. We do some pretty creative stuff in my department, and we're involved in training engineers. So we come with an attitude of how do you fix this problem. And whilst I accept that the engineering issues that you've raised are relevant and need to be considered, I yet to find something that I think is unsurmountable. Thank you.
Something that struck me in my ignorance that I hadn't really thought about was the burden of relatively recent health and safety regulations, CDM regs, and even back as far as Health and Safety at Work Act, the difficulties that might pose for a developer of something like this in terms of their workforce. It's difficult terrain, steep slopes, altitude, etc. You haven't mentioned that either, I don't think, in any of your criticisms either this morning or in writing. Is that fair?
It is fair, and that's precisely the point I'm making, that I have not sought to take on those engineering challenges, if you like. But my understanding of the new regulations is I mean, the first thing to say is that I'm well aware that the applicant organisation works to very high standards of safety, appropriately so. I looked at the car park this morning. The applicants' cars are all reversed in. It's a simple level of culture of awareness of safety. I unfortunately inappropriately drove him forward, but I take that for granted. But I still retain this position that ultimately, if there's a real motivation to get something done, and with all due respect to the applicant, there is a sense of wanting to support their committed position in terms of their proposal. So I do feel that the engineering challenges, despite the modernisation of the regulations, still means that these solutions can be found and so on. Essentially, what the modern regulations do is because of slack practice generally, is to begin to tighten that up. But the culture of this organisation's application actually means that they're comfortable within that. I don't believe that there's anything that we've suggested that is, I appreciate it's difficult, but I don't think there's anything that's insurmountable.
We're going to come on to assessing an MP's alternatives. I don't want to do that just now, but was there anything else you wanted to say about health and safety specifically for my benefit?
Comments could be made on a very general basis, sir, but I suspect they're probably done or probably offered in relation to the NMP alternatives, and Mr Clark in particular will be able to give some considerable assistance in that respect.
Fine, thank you. We'll leave it till then. Going back to the duties that the applicant was under, we talked yesterday, Dr Ford, about who ends up paying for these new transmission lines, and it's the consumer, effectively. And I'm sure you'll agree, therefore, that keeping costs under control is very important. They can't just go crazy. They have to have that very much at the forefront of their mind, how much it's going to cost.
Yes. However, aware of two things here, if you like. One is that I'm aware of other proposals. Well, first of all, I'm aware of other parts of the network which are underground, which is quite extensive. I think the numbers I put in is something like 1,500 kilometres of undergrounding work across the GB network. And also kind of related to that, almost all onshore wind farms overland cables, connections to the grid, are delivered by undergrounding. Now, in that case, the cost is not directly falling on the consumer. It's indirectly falling because the cost comes through to the energy charge, if you like. But it's interesting to note that almost all onshore cables, onshore connections to the grid, are running underground. So, for example, for Norfolk Viking, Norfolk Boreas offshore wind farm, I think it's a 70-kilometre underground cable across Norfolk. There are also other issues around the cost. There is overall an increased cost. That's not contested. But there's a balance here between the cost and the environmental impact. So if you like, let me use the term an environmental cost. So that's what we're weighing here. But I'll not go too much into the discussion of yesterday that if we put generation closer to generation, we reduce overall cost, but you're aware that stands. But the other thing that's relevant here is that the regulator who is monitoring the cost will respect the fact that if the ultimate solution that's recommended, if you like, or decided, is to underground substantial parts of this proposal, for example, through the national park or through the national scenic areas or so on, then the regulator has a choice to essentially sanction that. And as the applicant's VISTA programme shows, they are undergrounding in other areas of the national park.
Yeah, I'll come to Vista in a minute.
Yeah.
Just so I understand, you made a comparison with what happens with offshore, the onshore element of an offshore wind farm where, and I have some experience of this, where they were going through Carnoustie Golf Club underground. that is undergrounded. Kind of seems to be the default, at least
Yes.
for a lot of it. But that presumably doesn't have the same off-gem regulation to which this proposal is subject, or does it?
Yes, that's right. I accept that. But I'm also aware, if you like, that you'll be aware I participate in industry workshops and so on. I'm aware that there is a major proposal which is very controversial, very contentious, of about 180 kilometres down through East Anglia. I'm aware that the applicant, or will become the ultimate applicant in that case, is actually seriously looking at undergrounding. They've undergrounded in one section through a scenic area already, but they're also, as part of the proposal, but they're also reconsidering the proposal in terms of potentially undergrounding. I'm also aware that the director of the ESO, who is likely to become the director of the FSO once they're set up, is actually aware that the potential for overhead lines in sensitive areas is coming increasingly under tension. And whilst that's just obviously a comment by him, but there is a general acceptance within senior figures within the industry that the amount of overhead lines that are now required to deliver net zero is fairly substantial. And it would be, to be frank, I think the view is that it would be amazing if all of those were overhead lined. I know local authorities beginning to get wound up about it in all sorts of parts of the country, all through England and Wales. Kind of different situation in Scotland because of a different attitude, and obviously different density of population. But I think this balance between undergrounding and overhead line, my view is, from looking at the industry, is that position is shifting.
I appreciate that might be so. We might talk about that later. But just in terms of this proposal, you accept that this applicant is controlled by Ofgem, and we'll ask them what they say, because you make the point that, well, maybe Ofgem, if they're told they have to for environmental reasons, then they can factor that into their what they would approve, what they would sanction. But I mean, they are under a statutory duty under the Electricity Act to minimise costs, to keep, I've forgotten what the phrase is, I'm afraid, but to act economically, etc. But you accept that they're under that duty in addition to how the regulator might enforce that upon. Before we move on, do you want to come back on the question of costs?
I think it's really just to raise the point that with regard to the wind farms that have been referenced so far, we'd again like to highlight that those developers are obviously not subject to a regulator, and that the schemes, particularly the Viking scheme that has been referenced, that actually utilises HVDC technology, so it's not a direct comparison. Apologies, sir. It was just with reference to the offshore wind farms that have been discussed by Dr. Ford. We just highlight that obviously the developers, as you picked up, sir, are not subject to Ofgem and a regulator, so work under different economic environments than we do. With regard to the Viking project that was referenced, the technology used for the cable there is HVDC, whereas we are using HVAC cable types. They have different land take requirements, and obviously again the developer is under different economic environment, and they can choose to utilise that for their own benefit and do not have to justify that.
Yeah, do you want to say anything about that? You agree with all that?
Yes, I do. In terms of the HD alternating current rather than direct current issue, I mean, obviously there are different technologies, but fundamentally they serve the same purpose. They get electricity energy from one point to another point. You do need a conversion station, and if you like, there's a question mark of whether that conversion station sits on the coast, as is happening with some proposals, or whether it happens, if you like, adjoining to the national grid substation. But essentially they're both delivering energy.
I don't think we need to worry too much about that today, but I understand what you're saying. Can I ask what your understanding is of the Schedule 9 requirement to do what he reasonably can to mitigate effects on all those long list of environmental features? I think that's something that the applicant has said. It's a requirement to do what they reasonably can rather than just to do it.
Well, it's a kind of open question. It's got to be pertinent to the circumstances, I would have thought. There's obviously a list of factors, and I appreciate they're environmental factors rather than, if you like, human issues and so on.
Some of them might be human issues, depending on what you mean by human issues. What do you mean by human issues?
Yeah, it's what I was going to lead to was that specific mention within the EIA works regulations about the factors that need to be considered, but if you like, there's more emphasis in that of including human issues, in other words, habitation and where people are living. And
Can we just have a look at Schedule 9? I don't know if I'm struggling because I didn't write down the reference. If somebody can point me to the Act, we can just see what it says.
Sir, CD 11.4. Sorry, I've given you a tough reference, I'm afraid. Apologies.
It's actually reproduced in somebody's evidence. I'm just trying to. It's probably possibly in the topic paper from the applicant. I've just forgotten the wording of Schedule 9 and the second part, which says do what you reasonably can.
Yeah, we certainly make reference to it in paragraph 1.1.4 of, sorry, above that 1 point, where are we? Duties.
It's page 6, sir, 3.2.2 of the alternatives topic paper where the duties are summarised. It's page 6 of the applicant's topic paper, paragraph 3.2.2.
Excellent. You got that, Dr. Ford?
I've actually got the Act in front of me, so
even better. So, so the long list of factors: natural beauty, flora, fauna, geological, physiographical, protecting sites, buildings, objects of architectural, historic, archaeological interest, and then it's do what they reasonably can to mitigate. So not to eliminate any effect and not even to do it, but to do what they reasonably can to mitigate any effect that proposals would have on the natural beauty of the countryside or any flora, fauna, features, sites, buildings or objects. I just wondered what, and I'll be asking the applicant as well, what to do what they reasonably can means, in terms of the overall balance of how they design a proposal.
As you say, it goes back to the balance, basically. It's the list of factors that they have to consider in terms of the environmental issues. But it doesn't give an answer, if you like, between the trade-off between these three factors. And so, to my mind, reasonably can means, if you like, the equivalent in EIA jargon of mitigation or avoidance of effects and so on. So that's the way I tend to interpret it. But at the end of the day, it's a matter of applying these to the particular circumstances of the proposal.
I don't know if you want to say anything in particular about if you know what the answer is, or do you disagree with that? It's just part of the balance.
No fundamental disagreement. I think the key point from our perspective is that the routing guidance that SCN follows sets out clearly how SCN, the applicant, has sought to discharge their duties under the Act. And in fact, actually goes beyond that list of requirements in setting out more clearly and following contemporary practice how we consider, well, there was reference to the lack of consideration of human issues, and that is clearly front and centre in the guidance.
Thank you. Can we have a look at your statement, Dr. Ford, paragraph 2.12? The main alternative
main hearing statement.
Hearing statement, not the not a rebuttal or anything, just the main.
So this is where I've described the two steps that they're using.
Yeah, I'm going to check I've got the right paragraph number, because that may not be what I was looking at.
2.12, but it's only The numbering doesn't work like that. Oh, 2.12.
Yeah, it might not be 212. Can't read my own notes.
I think there are multiple paragraph 2.12, sir.
Ah, okay.
Oh, yes, sorry. Apologies for that, sir.
No, that was just keeping my toes.
I do it mindfully, unfortunately.
I'm looking at the one that starts on PDF page 8.
Right.
Whilst the applicant has set out reasonable alternatives. Just my question really was just a bit more detail on about a third of the way through the paragraph it starts. There is also no indication that a competent expert was involved in considering the environmental aspects of the regional level INC study. Had this been done, it's possible ANC submission would have taken a different view on the MPA's remarks rather than treating this as a black flag. But just the absence of a competent expert at the INC stage, have you got evidence, or you just haven't found that was the case?
No, it's not based on evidence in terms of knowing who did the work or didn't do the work kind of thing. It's really just a kind of critical appraisal, basically. It doesn't appear, and I don't think it was actually intended to undertake environmental considerations. The balance of what they seem to be looking at the INC stage was primarily economic. And therefore, there's obviously some awareness of the environmental issues. I'm not suggesting there isn't any consideration, but where I feel they're flawed is that they essentially, for example, on the Inverarnan Inverary option that was considered at the Lochy INC stage, they simply accepted the black flag from the National Park Authority and didn't actually go on to test whether that was valid or not. And with all due respect to the planning authority, any planning authority, sometimes they get it wrong. I mean, we get appeal decisions which overturn planning authority decisions, so you can't just take that as a read. But what they hadn't done, in my view, is to go on to actually consider the environmental consequences of the proposal and to test out whether the National Park Authority, if like, was giving a sound, concluded decision. I mean, I've been a planning officer in development control myself. Sometimes you give some casual guidance in early stages of the application, and you turn out, it turns out to be not entirely accurate. I mean, I appreciate the National Park Authority have a strong interest in protecting the environment within the national park, but at the end of the day, the question is, was it appropriately applied?
You agree that the Holford rules, which you think are very important, Rule 1 in that says avoid altogether, if possible, the national parks. So
yes,
maybe that was giving them an answer even without asking what the Park Authority would say.
I do accept, sir. I do accept, there's no doubt about that. But of course, the other option in those scenarios was to underground. The other thing is that the evidence which is in the documentation about their communications with the National Park Authority seems to me to be quite light, if I can put it that way.
Okay, well, go back to the applicant then. So I think the assertion is that there was no meaningful assessment of environmental effects at the INC stage. How do you respond to that?
So I think, firstly, sir, we would like to address the point that there was no involvement from environmental side during the INC assessment. This was an internal assessment that was undertaken within SSEN. The environmental inputs were led by Richard Baldwin, who is our head of consents and environment within the company. You can actually see he is referenced on the letter from Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park that we received following our correspondence with them. It is also worth noting that Richard was heavily involved in the development of our routing guidance, both within the 2018 and 2020 versions of that. It was ultimately his view, based on the application of our routing guidance, that it was not worthwhile taking forward the option for the routing into the national park for this INC assessment that we're undertaking at this stage. Thank you.
I'll give you any reassurance. It was the applicant's own internal environmental expert who the one who actually was involved heavily in the routing guidance itself, who was involved in that decision, not...
It does, sir, and I'm pleased to hear that that was taken into account. But I still feel we're left with this gap between what I've described, the regional level assessment, and from what's just been described, there wasn't... kind of looked at the principles as opposed to getting into the detail of considering the environmental effects of the proposal. So the language used was not worth taking forward. That doesn't sound to me like we looked at it and we considered the potential environmental effects and we concluded because of the potential environmental effects that these shouldn't be taken forward. That's not quite this. And my suggestion here is, sir, that actually they do have to move beyond this kind of, I don't want to use the word casual, but simply just a rejection by the park authority, and there has to be some consideration of the options.
So this issue is addressed at quite a bit of detail between pages 33 and 36 of the applicant's rebuttal statement, which I'm assuming Dr. Ford has read, and in some way what he wrongly does is conflates two separate processes. So if you need any further assistance on the point, I'm happy to expand, but sir, the issue has been covered.
Can I just quickly refer to this to make sure I fully understand it? Give me a second. Wish to look at that rebuttal as well, just in case.
It's the rebuttal hearing statement, and it's between pages 33 and 37, and the issues are crystallised at paragraphs 80 to 82 on page 36.
Can I just confirm, are you including within this your assessment of the law in this as well?
Your client and your group has raised issues which relate to the legal requirements, so by necessity the applicant has responded and provided some assistance to the report in relation to what the law is on EIA requirements.
But the sections that you've given us include your mentions of the Gathacol case and so on. Yes. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. But as I say, the points are crystallised at paragraphs 80 to 82 on page 36.
Ultimately, where I was going is wanting to be able to advise ministers if there is a sort of challenge to the legality of the assessment that has gone into the project. And if that's what you're saying, then I want to be able to tell them what you're saying and why they're saying it and what the applicant says in defence.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm just going to have a quick read of these to see if I've got any further questions.
Okay. So which?
Have you had a chance to read through that, Dr. Ford?
Yes.
I appreciate you're not a lawyer, and I'm happy if you want to adjourn and confer with Mr. Campbell, but and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but The applicant has explained its understanding of the law, what stages are bound by the 2017 EIA regs, etc., and they're quite confident that they fully complied with all requirements. Are you challenging that?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I believe their application of the Gathercote case is not quite correct. If you have the case in front of you, sir.
Where am I looking? Which point me to where I should be looking?
In the case report, the judgment, section 49.
We're not clear that this case has been lodged, either Gathercote or Holohan, which is referred to. Perhaps my friend can correct me if I'm wrong.
No, they haven't been lodged, sir. They are available through the normal searches, but I think the point is that there's no response, if you like, or nothing from the NMP which suggests that we're wrong. So if there were to be a submission made at this hearing rather than in closing submission, one would have thought that the NMP would have set out their position in law and lodged the relevant cases which they supports that position. That hasn't happened.
Positions set out quite clearly in the rebuttal statement. These cases are the application of these authorities are challenged. It's a legal matter. I would respectfully suggest that it's probably best dealt with in closing submissions rather than having a legal debate on the floor of the inquiry, but it's a matter for you entirely.
I'm quite content to leave it to submissions, and in the event that I remain uncertain, I will come back to you, but if you're content with that, I'm quite happy to leave it. That's probably easier than trying to put Dr. Ford on the spot.
I'm actually content to take it forward, sir. But
Mr. Campbell might not want to take it. Hang on, Dr. Ford. Mr. Campbell might want to.
I'm not
to take it forward, and he leave it for his expertise to deal with, perhaps in closing.
Indeed, sir. What I was really pointing towards was just the number of the issues, basically, which I think is pertinent to the discussion, and that is that there seems to be a difference between considering issues of alternatives in terms of the depth that the chosen proposal is taken forward. I mean, one of the criticisms that the applicant makes of our position is that we're suggesting that they should have considered the alternatives to the same level of analysis of environmental impact assessment as the proposal. We are not suggesting that. But there is, nevertheless, in making choices about alternatives, a requirement on the applicant to explain the environmental reasons why they are making those choices. And we'll flush this out in closing submissions, but it's very clear that the Holohan case specifically says, and it indicate a reasons for his choice, that's under alternatives and the preferred choice, taking into account at least environmental effects. And with all respect to the applicant, I don't think the MPA's views represents an assessment. Doesn't need to be to the level of an environmental impact assessment, but they do have to assess the environmental effects. Simply taking the park authority's word is not sufficient in our view.
Do you want to say anything now or leave it for later?
So so the applicant understands what the supposed failings are, is the only supposed failing under the EIA regulations related to its assessment and description of the National Parks Authority's position in the EIA report. In other words, all the other stuff is not the grounds for criticism, because there are a number of criticisms made in the NMP original submission and in the original hearing statement. But I think the point you're making as to what you take from the Holland case relates specifically to the position of the National Park Authority. Is that the criticism?
No, it goes beyond that, in the sense of it affects the subsea cable route as well. Essentially, at the INC...
So just so I'm clear then, there are two issues. One is the subsea cable, which is NMP Alt 5, is that right?
Yep.
And the second is the decision related to the National Parks position.
Yes, essentially, you had three principal options at the INC stage, is my understanding. Two subsea cables, it's different routes, but essentially a subsea cable, if you like, as an option. So you had the proposal, the Inverarnan Inverary route, and the subsea routes, if you like. That's why I'm taking three. So my view is that, our view is that in identifying your proposal, the final proposal, and making that choice, you are required to give environmental, in the language, at least the environmental effects that you've taken into account.
And do you say that that applies to the Lochy process, the options that are considered under Lochy?
What I'm saying, sir, is that these are reasonable alternatives that you have considered. I appreciate you consider them at the INC Lochy stage, but the fact is you have studied them. And that's where I think you fall within the remit of the EIA regulations. And therefore, you have to apply the EIA regulations, if you like, because you've studied them. By definition, you've defined them as being reasonable alternatives with respect.
So, if I understand the logic, then essentially any potential technical option which is considered at the Lochy stage, in your view, would require to be the subject of detailed environmental assessment, not just appraisal, detailed environmental assessment with a comparison, a detailed level of the comparison between the effects for all of those options. That's the logic of your argument, isn't it?
The question is, you're emphasising detail. I'm not suggesting that you need to go to the level that you would do with the environmental impact assessment, but you still need to be aware of the environmental choices, and that's really the criticism here: is that you haven't gone on to consider the environmental choices. I mean, we talked about the overhead line through the national park, for example, and that conflicting with Holford Rules 1. But of course, there are already overhead lines through the national park. The reality is that the applicant put an overhead line through the national park since the national park was formed in 2002. An overhead line was put in 2007, and so they've, if you like, already run up against the Holford Rule 1 on that occasion, because obviously it was in place at that time. And part of the contention here is that we are saying that whilst we're describing this as a new line, this is also potentially a replacement for an existing circuit, where the relative environmental effects will not be the same as a virgin line on an entirely virgin site, if you like.
Just explain to me that point, a replacement for an existing circuit.
So between Inverary and Inverarnan, there is already a 132 overhead line circuit. And what we're suggesting is that this is, if you like, an upgrading, an uprating. It's not, it's effectively, it's a replacement. I'm not suggesting they're going to string 2, 3, 5 double circuits on the existing poles or anything like that. But the point is, that the impact of that environmental effect is already existing. And
you're not suggesting it would apply, or it would be eligible for Vista funding or something like that. You're just saying you're not comparing it against a virgin.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
So, sir, first of all, in relation to the legal issue, that does go back to the terms of the EI regulations and how they apply, which are quoted on page 33 of the rebuttal hearing statement for the applicant, relating to a description of the reasonable alternatives studied by the developer, which are relevant to the development and its specific characteristics, and then an indication of the main reasons for the options chosen, which the applicant says is exactly what has been done in accordance with normal practice in the EIA report. On the technical point that Dr. Forrest just raised, Mr. Stewart will want to respond, I imagine.
I may also invite my colleague Douglas Hill to add any comments that he may wish, but my understanding of that line that runs from Inverary out towards the National Park, the 132 kV overhead line, would need to remain intact due to the purpose it serves on our network and serving those substations, and any additional line, if it were to be taken forward at 275 kV, would be a further overhead line that we've taken forward into that area.
We'll maybe talk about that a bit later on as well. But I think I understand where we're coming from. We'll leave it to submissions in writing. I think I can understand, at the moment anyway, sufficiently for me to move on.
So I think Mr. Bruce would actually like to add a little bit to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It's just in terms of this consideration of reasonable alternatives are relevant. In that context, it might be helpful to think of some analogies to other sectors of development. When we're working on a wind farm site, we're working within a site land option that the developer has to work with. We don't then have to go and consider whether we should instead build a wind farm on another site 5 kilometres away or 50 kilometres away. Similarly, if we were working on a tall building, EIA in London, in Blackfriars, we don't have to consider a tall building in Farringdon as an alternative option. It's not reasonable, it's not relevant.
Just one point, sir, is that I believe what was just said about the third line, position of the third line is new to the inquiry.
It's stuff that.
I don't know, shortly. I know there was some comment about infrastructure going up on some of the alternatives that you suggested and whether that would be replaced or not. I'm not entirely sure if it's new or not, but we'll maybe come back to that rather than, unless you want to fully accept it's new information. I'm not necessarily saying that's a problem, but I recall the question mark as to whether the assets would be replaced or not in relation to alternative routes. So I think it has been raised by somebody, but unless I'm imagining it. Do you want to say anything at this point, or should we leave it until we come back to talk about your alternatives?
We've nothing to add.
We will see whether it's, yeah, okay. We'll move on. Then I wanted to look at 2.7 in your statement, Dr. Ford.
Starts the INC optioneering.
Yes, thank you. Towards the end of that paragraph, however, the applicant gave no consideration to the fact that the proposal is located in a designated area of panoramic quality and any impacts on such an area. The APQ is equivalent to a regional scenic area, yes. However, it's notable that the national park area is not all designated as a national scenic area. First point, you're not trying to say that an APQ is equivalent to a national park that isn't NSA, I don't think.
No.
Good. And just to get my mind straight, the NSA designation obviously happened long before national parks in Scotland came in, about 20 years before. Might it be unreasonable to assume that parts of a national park that aren't also NSA are inferior in landscape quality to those parts that are within the NSA? Maybe the decisions 20 years apart were simply different, and perhaps the later designation as national park recognised the qualities of something that were overlooked when the NSA designation. Is it not the case? We simply don't know, and it's perhaps unfair to point out that parts of the national park that aren't NSA are somehow lesser.
It's a reasonable proposition, sir, and I understand that. The way actually, as a matter of fact, when I started doing this work, I simply worked to the national park area. And it was only later on I realised that actually the NSA is quite concentrated around the Loch Lomond itself, obviously, as far as this proposal is concerned. And then and I kind of went through that thinking process about, the NSA's really extent to cover the national park boundary, if you like. And then I thought, given the park in existence, it would be perfectly proper for them to extend the NSA if they wish to, and to go through that process.
But they wouldn't need to. Given that,
agreed?
Yeah, MPF4, if I may finish, MPF4 groups NSA and National Park, sure, and then everything else is inferior.
Yeah,
as does Holford.
I fully accept that. But I came to the conclusion, if you like, this is going to sound terribly crude, But if the national park represents a value of 10 in terms of environmental importance, and the RSA, the APQ represents 5, these are not meant to be appropriate graduation or anything like that. My feeling was that the area of the national park with the NSA in it represents an 11, if you like. I thought it was a bit more important. And actually, when you look at it, there's obviously a difference between the wild areas that are not in the NSA and within the national park. I mean, obviously the impact of the existing overhead lines on the NSA is quite minimal, whereas obviously they run through the national park. So I do think there's if you like, a bit of a step up is the way. But at the end of the day, sir, these are going to be your choices and your decision.
And I think you just accepted that NPF 4 makes no distinction between NSA and National Park. They're the same.
Yes.
They are the best.
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Anything to say on National Park? No. Okay. Briefly on Vista, not a scheme I'm very familiar with, but I understand that is only applicable to undergrounding of existing assets. It's a separate fund that's available to improve existing features. It wouldn't apply to something like this where you're creating a new line.
That's right. But the reality is that the regulator has approved this concept of undergrounding in scenic areas. It's happening not just in the applicant's area, but throughout the country. So there's areas in Dorset, for example, where they're undergrounding existing overhead lines. But there is, if you like, an underlying logic here that undergrounding, in scenic areas is actually something that's quite doable. One of the options, given the amount of infrastructure that's got to be built to deliver net zero over the next 2 or 3 decades, is that undergrounding is we're moving towards a position where undergrounding is more acceptable as normal by the regulator. One of the things that's happening with the centralising of transmission planning under the ISOP that we talked about yesterday is consideration within the overall strategic process of environmental considerations within that process, as opposed to this idea that we look at the technical and the economic at one stage and then take the environmental stuff through a separate process. They're lifting the environmental considerations up into the strategic planning process, and there is a general acceptance that across the regulators that actually undergrounding will be necessary for new infrastructure. If you like, the Vista programme and the equivalent programmes with the other transmission authorities is addressing problems of the past. But there's no reason why we should go through the fairly perverse option of building an overhead line and then underground it later. We can just go straight to undergrounding.
Who is it who pays for the Vista projects? That's not the bill payer, is it?
That's through the regulator, goes on to the transmission charges.
What I'm saying is, ultimately, we've talked about you and I having to foot the bill for something like this new line, and I think you accepted that they can't go crazy with, providing the Rolls-Royce of power lines. But are you saying that you and I will also have to pay for Vista improvements? Is it the same effect?
It's not have to. You are.
That's our understanding, sir.
Okay, I'm glad I'm paying for that.
We all are, sir.
Do you accept that the applicant's point is undergrounding doesn't mean no impact? There is still a requirement for a corridor, even after they finish building it. There'll be as a kind of a sanitised corridor that you can't do certain things within. Do you accept that?
I do accept there'll be a corridor. I do accept there'll be impact. But the notion of sanitised, I think, is a bit overstated. Yes, sure. Essentially, what you have to do is to consider the relative environmental impacts. Okay, so with an underground cable, I mean, there are underground cables that people just don't recognise and see and know. I mean, ignoring the stuff that goes on in the distribution level, but even transmission level, there is underground cable taking provision where people just don't know it's there, frankly. And I appreciate some of the, particularly the ground conditions, for example, through over the hills and through the peat areas, will be challenging in engineering terms. There's no, I don't doubt that. But nevertheless, the residual effects of an underground cable, if I can describe it as that, compared to residual effects of an overhead line, there's obviously a substantial difference in terms of the landscape and visual impacts. The applicants earlier on referred to ceiling end compounds. That depends on whether it's part done or whole done. And obviously, as we've already said earlier on, there's already existing infrastructure in and around the national park.
Yeah, I think, and I was going to come to ceiling end compounds because I think the applicant will tell us the scale of a 275 kV piece of kit is an order of magnitude above what you'd get with a 132 kV. I think that's what they've told us. You accept that, do you? It's a fairly hefty piece of kit.
Yeah, it's bigger, but sorry?
They tell us it's a lot bigger. I might have misinterpreted the figures.
Yeah, well, I read the lot as well, and I thought, are you kind of overstating that? It's the scale up, but essentially, it still needs the same physical ability to bring the power down off an overhead line and put it underground. So there's all the technical stuff, there's reactive power things, and those kind of details, and yes, they're bigger.
And where you go, or the line goes through woodland, you will lose the trees with an underground route, inevitably. Is that right?
It depends on how they do it. I mean, there's actually two corridors that we're talking about here. One is the working corridor whilst they're undertaking the construction, and then is the residual corridor of the underground cable itself, and they will typically put that in ducts, and they obviously need to cope with the three phases, and there'll be this double circuits here. So, and they're probably not going to use the same configuration, if you like, underground as they are going to do overground. So there'll be an area of ground, if you like, the width of it, which I think they give a figure for, and actually it's slightly above the figures I'm seeing for other underground cables elsewhere, but so much. But that kind of 45 to 50 metre construction corridor can accommodate trees, if you like. You can move around the trees, and so you only really need to take the trees out where the infrastructure is going to be in the long term. If the access track, has got some trees in the way of it, you can take the access track round. We're talking minutes of extra driving and things like that. So I think the residual effects of an underground cable are substantially lower.
No, I understand the point. Can you tell me something about the sort of technicalities involved in putting in an underground cable, both the act of putting it in and then what you're allowed to do within the corridor subsequently? That would be very helpful.
So the activities of an underground cable are very different to an overhead line. By the very nature of the type of works we carried out, the cable in itself has got an entire track route that needs to be accessed. Whereas an overhead line, you're generally accessing from the towers and doing the work from the individual towers, which then removes opportunity for any mitigation between the towers. For the cable for the circuits of this size, and they are very large capacity circuits, we have estimated what a running track or access track would require to be, and the separation between those cables, and that's where we came up with our extended corridor. From an operational sense, I would emphasise that corridor is a retained fixed corridor. We talked about fuzzy edges yesterday on forestry, where you can, as I said, you could sort of bring trees in. You can't do that when you're trying to maintain a corridor for these cables. And another thing I'd like to add is on these cable circuits, they are large capacity. I don't know where Mr. Ford has seen circuits of this capacity undergrounded before, but it won't be in our area because we've never undergrounded circuits of this capacity. So I'd welcome advice on that.
When it comes to the cable ceiling ends, again, we've asked our engineers to come up with an indicative design. They've not gone into the detailed setting out of that compound. We actually believe it may in fact be bigger, so we've actually taken a conservative view in those numbers. But for each of those phases, and by phase there's 3 phases to a circuit, so each arm and cross arm, we would require 4 individual 275 cables. So we'd eventually have 24 cables. So there's 6 phases on the overhead line, which is one on each side of the cross arm. So for each one of those phases, to obtain the capacity required, we'd require 4 cables, 4 275 cables. So it'd be 24 cables. Yeah, sorry. And in addition to that, we've also got the fibre optic cable that's required for the communications and earthing and protection systems. So that's why in this instance we do have an extended corridor. It's not in any way similar to the Vista schemes that we've seen elsewhere recently. It's very different, and it's certainly not similar to your HVDC lines.
Apologies, sir. I was just going to add there, just relating to the sizes of a 132 kV ceiling end compound versus a 275. In paragraph 3.4.9 of our alternatives topic paper, we highlight that for a 132 kV circuit, you'd be looking at a plan area of 40 by 40 metres for 132 kV double circuit. And in paragraph 3.4.12 of the same paper, we highlight that it's 75 by 55 metres for the 275 kV cable arrangement that my colleague Mr Clark has just described. And just picking up on an element Dr Ford noted, he referenced the inclusion of reactive power equipment within the cable ceiling end compound. That is not included for within that footprint. If it were to be, we'd again see a substantial increase in the size of the cable ceiling end footprint.
So Mr Stewart can also add some more detail if you require in relation to the Vista scheme, but it is dealt with at section 3.4 of his topic paper. If you...
I have read it. I think my only area of ignorance was actually who pays the bill for it, and now I know, so that's interesting.
And lastly, sir, in this area, Mr Bruce, we want to highlight the potential implications for peatland within the corridor.
Yeah, so we've touched on woodland, and that would need to be removed. It's also the case where the line would cross any peatland. There's an expectation from SEPA and Nature Scott under current policy that any peatland put back into position would be capable of achieving a functional habitat status, and effectively with the requirements around temperatures of the cables and the cover, it doesn't allow you to place peat back on top of the cables, so you would need to fill over with virgin material, and that peat would have to be treated, well, fundamentally we try not to treat it as a waste, but it would have to be taken off-site and dealt with in some other way. And as you know, peat and soils are a key consideration under MPF 4, so that would be another significant factor to be weighed in the balance.
Just clarify on the tree point. I think, did you say that you wouldn't be able to put tree, or the landowner wouldn't be able to put trees back on top of your cables subsequently? Is that right?
That's correct, yes. And similarly for the access along the cable. So along the cable we'd have joint bays because the cables are limited in length, and link boxes, and they require access to be available. For circuits of this nature, we would absolutely require access. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that the minimum corridor width would need to be maintained as a straight edge. If you wanted fuzzy edges, it's actually going beyond that to create that fuzzy edge. Yeah.
Do you want to come back on any of those tree or peat implications points?
I actually tried to find out where you've got some heavy voltage underground cables and didn't get an answer, but so I was interested to know. I think in one of my submissions I've given data in terms of underground cabling elsewhere in the country. National Grid data is actually publicly available. They have 400 kV underground as well as 275 kV, so it's clearly possible. Different environment, I accept that. In terms of the access tracks, quite right that you need a running track for the length of the cable if you're undergrounding, but obviously you do still need access tracks for putting an overhead line, and effectively they're equivalent to the length of the the overhead line. In fact, if you look at the data for, and the applicant's been kind enough to give us the GIS data on that, and thanks very much for that. That's very helpful. But obviously the access tracks to the pylons are far longer than the line for the current proposal, for example. So it's not. You have to be careful. We're talking apples and pears here. Just one other point, and that is that I appreciate it's not the primary solution here, but it's quite possible in some situations, particularly crossings and other situations, to use horizontal directional drilling where they go, if you like, underneath the ground, more than just an opening in the ground, putting in ducts and backfilling kind of stuff. So horizontal directional drilling can typically, I think for 275, these guys can correct me, but typically I think we're talking about lengths of 800 metres between access points. So that would be the normal maximum length you'd want to go to, but horizontal directional drilling can go out to 1.5 kilometres.
Presumably you wouldn't still want peat and trees on top of your cables even if you drilled under them.
Yeah.
I suppose a couple of points to clarify there, sir. Just with regards to National Grid, who obviously operate the grid or the transmission owner south of the border, they also operate in a very different environment to ourselves at SSEN Transmission, with a much greater density of urban type areas to work within, and that can lead to them having a higher proportion of underground cables to facilitate the works that they do there. And also generally where they are not even within an urban environment, they do have a different type of natural environment that we operate within. So that all has to be factored in and considered the solutions that they will take forward. Just with regards to the horizontal directional drill, we have on paragraph 3.4.17 of the alternatives topic paper highlighted some of the concerns that we have with the use of that type of installation method, particularly for critical circuits such as the 275 kV ones that we are looking at here. Effectively, when you do use this method to install cables, the drill effectively closes the ground around the cable again. Effectively becomes inaccessible at that point. Whereas under normal installations, we would use ducts where we would be able to pull the cables back. In the event of fault in the cable in a section we have used HDD, horizontal directional drill, we would not be able to pull that back. We'd have to look at procuring new cable and reinstalling that. So particularly on this type of circuit, it is not what we look at as a viable option. And we do set that out in 3.4.17. I think, again, with regard to the vegetation on top, with peat, again, the cables will still emit heat and cause issues with that type of landscape and could damage it and prevent it being maintained in its current state.
Final point, which I think Dr. Ford said, was, I think you said inevitably the length of construction roads, service roads, whatever you want to call them, would be greater with pylon than with an underground line. Is that? Do you accept that?
Not entirely. For an overhead line, we would put in access points to every tower because we need to access every tower to physically build it, but not every track would be permanent. We try to utilise existing trackway and upgrade existing forestry trackway. That way we're minimising any additional damage. Permanent tracks should be agreed as the operational minimum. Should a line be damaged in a storm, we need to get to a relevant pulling point to pull new conductor. We can't just join it together. We have to go to a pulling point and re-pull that section of conductor. So we only retain the tracks we absolutely need or that have been consented by the landowner. It's sometimes the case the landowner wants to keep the track in and they may consent it themselves. For a cable, I don't think I said we need to retain a permanent access track. What I said, we need to retain a route that is accessible. Now, that may be by different means of vehicles. But to the key joints, we would keep that key access track would be retained. But for that cable section, you still need to get to the cable section. And you still have towers at either end. So if you're talking about an 800-metre cable section, you're probably only talking about 3 spans. So you're not actually talking about the difference of 2 towers, the access tracks to 2 towers. So you could have that as a potential saving, but you're still going to need access to link boxes and joint bays in the middle.
And just one thing, I think, to add to that, obviously you need a heavy reasonable sized crane for your tower construction, so your access tracks for overhead lines are fairly substantial, whereas undergrounding, you're using different kind of, basically you're opening the ground, putting in your ducts, and I would think the most significant part of the heavy equipment, if you like, of putting in an underground cable is actually bringing the cable in itself and the pulling gear.
First of all, on the overhead lines, we wouldn't necessarily use a crane for every tower, no. We can use alternative methods. We would prefer to use a crane, but if a crane wasn't suitable for the site, we can use other methods. For the cable, I think from memory, the cable excavation would be in the region of 6 metres wide, so that would be a fairly substantial excavator. And I would say that's going to be substantially heavier than the actual cable pulling equipment itself. And you also need area on which to put the spoil, and given the nature of the ground, that has to be well enough away from the working strip from the excavation to allow the excavator to pass, plus the vehicles to actually then service the materials coming in the trench.
Okay, it's nearly break time, but I've only got a couple of quick questions, I think, before we can move on to the assessment of NNP's alternatives. First point was, Dr. Ford, your paragraph 3.7 of your statement, where you say, I think I forgot to ask this in the policy session, or maybe I did, but I've forgotten what the answer was, so I'm asking it again. NPF 4 Policy 11E requires consideration of undergrounding to be applied where possible. That implies consideration should be given to undergrounding for the whole of any proposed transmission overhead line. It's clearly possible for the whole of the current proposal to be undergrounded, and the applicant didn't do that. Are you really standing by that interpretation of possible? It's a very literal interpretation, bearing in mind what we've heard about the constraints.
Yes, and we highlighted this difference yesterday in the policy session between Mr. Bell and myself about what the NPF 4 terms mean. Mr. Bell was pointing to the fact that it only relates to grid connections for wind farms, I think was really what he was going to. My view is that the NPS phrase applies to grid infrastructure, I think, is the phrase, and therefore, my view is it applies to this proposal.
I remember now that there was that question: does it apply just to connection points, etc.? But just in terms of the word possible, is NPF4 really that anything's possible? I suppose. Is it really fair to interpret it so literally?
Difficult to work that one out. I mean, I don't want to get too much involved in this, but my feeling is it's a term that appeared in the final draft, and I wonder how much full consideration was given to it, to be frank. But literally, that's what it says. It says possible, with all due respect, and therefore, so I know in other proposals and other cases I've dealt with, the applicant has considered the whole length of the line, or certainly for individual applications. In one case, 33 kilometres of undergrounding.
Putting it another way, would you say that was a reasonable alternative in terms of the EIA regs that should have been considered?
Yes, I'm saying, and I feel that this new term in NPF 4 effectively places that burden on the applicant for considering it at the EIA stage. And I know in other applications, not with this applicant, but with other transmission owners, they are doing that.
Sir, I rely on the evidence given yesterday by Mr. Bell as to whether this statement is relevant at all. Even if it is the absolutist position adopted by Dr. Ford, as he does for many of the issues before the inquiry, doesn't sit with a fair reading of the policy, I would suggest. It is really essentially a matter for you and a matter for planning evidence. But insofar as there is any expectation within NPF 4 that this type of infrastructure, transmission infrastructure, that consideration is given where possible, that has in fact happened.
Okay, that was all I had in terms of the NNP's criticisms of the applicant's handling of alternatives. Let's turn to Ms. Platt. Sorry, I didn't forget you were there, but I haven't asked you any questions. Was there anything you wanted to add from your side, your perspective, on the applicant's assessment before we come after the break to look at your alternatives?
I'm happy that we will cover any of those aspects within the alternative section. I think as we go through each one, those issues will come out naturally, so I'm happy with that for now.
Thank you. Dr. Ford, Mr. Campbell, anything that we haven't covered that you want to on your criticisms effectively of how the applicant has progressed this?
Sir, while Dr. Ford's looking at his notes, can I just clarify one point? It's a personal, professional matter that I've been involved in for a long time. Reference was made to national scenic areas as being Scotland's best landscapes. I'm sure you know the history going back to Bill Murray's survey of the Highlands by the National Trust of Scotland in 1962. National scenic areas are exemplar landscapes. They are examples of Scotland's best landscapes. They are not an absolute list of only the best landscapes in Scotland. So I've had an involvement in this a long time, sir. I just wanted to check that you were aware of that subtle distinction.
Thank you, and I wasn't, so thank you for that.
I've just got one point, sir, which is actually in our submission, so we don't need to go over it. But just this point about whether the inclusion of the Craig Dube to Inverarnan line should be part of the application, those kind of issues. So just to put it on the table, you have our submissions and so on.
Was this the, I hate the phrase salami slicing thing, which we've talked about in other places, and it's relevant or not? Was that the point? Yeah.
It is, sir, so I'm sure you're familiar with it.
I think, sir, we'd like to take this opportunity to clarify, because we have noted a number of references within MP documentation to that our proposal does not stand alone as such. What we would like to clarify is that this overhead line that are proposed, that we're taking forward, in conjunction with a consented Craigdhu substation connected to our existing 132 kV network, does facilitate the export of onshore wind generation that's contracted to SSEN transmission at this moment in time. So as such, we do not need to consider the Inverarnan Craigdhu overhead line that we acknowledge is currently working its way through a Section 37 application at this moment in time. But without it, we are still able to export out of Argyll using the overhead line and the consented Craigdhu substation. Of course.
So just as a EIA practice clarification point as well, when we're considering developments from a cumulative perspective, it's at the point of preparing an EIA, you have to consider both what's reasonably foreseeable and the level of detail available. And at the point we were dealing with that, we may have been able to foresee a link, but no project specifics. So I think it's picked up through the EIA, but not in any level of detail. But having said that, the current scheme going through the system, the scheme that's in front of us just now was already ahead of it, so therefore is a cumulative development in that EIA and should be dealt with under that consenting process.
Just looking at the geography, because I'm not familiar or that familiar with this part of the world, and I do like NMP 14 that you produced, Dr. Ford, which shows your alternatives and how they fit into the geography and compare with where the substation is and all of that. But does that show the 132 kV line NMP 14 is? Does that, just for my own education?
It is visible in the base map, in actual fact, so we can help point that out to you. So it runs kind of diagonally from the Inverarnan substation towards Tainault.
I am heading down towards Inverarnan anyway, so I'll be looking out for that line, and I think I can orient myself accordingly. You don't disagree with that point, do you, that there is an existing 132 kV that will plug into Craigdhu approved substation and thence into this new line if it were approved? You accept that?
I'm not entirely comfortable with it, sir. Just a couple of points. One thing that the applicant said was that this proposal does not stand alone.
Apologies, sir. It's quite the opposite. That the proposal does stand alone in conjunction with the Consentus Craigview substation connected to the 132 kV network.
Okay.
Also, sir, just looking at the NMP submissions, the 132 kV line is shown on their mapping, and it is shown just sitting. You can follow it. It sits to the southwest of our Craigview substation, so it's a blue line with red dots to note the towers. And you can follow that working its way back down towards Inverarnan in their mapping. That line ultimately terminates up at Tainolt, and is connected to a number of hydro schemes at that end of the line.
Line actually crosses the loch?
From memory, sir, I believe it does. It does.
I don't actually have, my colleague actually produced that map, and I don't actually have it, I'm afraid. But just in terms of the issue here, of whether this proposal, can work with the current 132, obviously this is a substantially higher line, and I don't want to get involved in need here, but it seems to me that its ability to export must be limited of the existing infrastructure. Fundamentally,
Sure, you'll accept that that's not your ultimate plan, but did you want to come back on that?
You're correct, sir, that ultimately there's a longer and wider scheme that will bring 275 kV from the connection point with Scottish Power transmissions overhead line right the way down to Crossaig, further down the peninsula. This is an interim stage that we introduce, so where we energise this line at 275 kV in conjunction with Craigdhu and the connection to the 132 kV network. In introducing Craigdhu onto the network, what that allows us to do is draw load off of the existing 132 kV network, and that enables contracted generators to join the 132 kV network, and through that we are then able to transmit them onto the 275 kV overhead line using Craigdhu.
just on that point, sir, I think we're into questions of need by that discussion.
Well, we're not going. It was just an interesting discussion of an alternative, and I have enough on that. Thank you. Let's break for coffee. Come back at, well, we might as well say 12 o'clock. Thank you. If you can lean closer to the microphone as I do without getting too close, as I also do, that would be appreciated. Particularly the applicant's end of the room is particularly quiet, I understand it, so don't be shy to lean in and project. Thank you. So we've come to the second half of the agenda, which is looking at the alternatives that NNP has put forward. Just check, Ms. Platt, you can hear and be heard well?
Yes, I can hear you all. I can hear you, sir, and I can see you. So, assuming it's all well from my side as well.
Yeah, we can hear you fine. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, as I said, NNP drawings I thought were very helpful. NNP 14 and 15. So was that actually Ms. Platt rather than yourself, Dr. Ford? Who produced those?
Yes. Ms. Platt produced them. I produced the early maps, and Ms. Platt's been good enough to put them together.
Excellent. Thank you, Ms. Platt. I found that very helpful, just so I can understand where we're going. So I'll obviously be referring to those as we go through them. So I had two preliminary matters to discuss relating to NNP's methodology for how they've done a comparative assessment, and then to look at each of the alternatives that NNP has put forward in turn. So if we look at NNP's methodology, it just starts on page 8 of Dr. Ford's statement. It's helpfully explained sort of step by step as you go through it how how you've undertaken your comparative analysis. I'm saying you, Dr. Ford, because it's in your statement. Was it you who did the analysis, or was it Ms. Platt? So I know who to ask questions of.
Ms. Platt's done the landscape. I've done the, if you like, the quantification with the view shed. I've carried out that part.
I'll start with you then. And then, but if you know, obviously refer me to your colleague if I'm asking the wrong person the questions. I will tell you, Mr. Campbell. 3.2, yes. So it explains comparative analysis of overland alternatives, uses viewshed modelling, or ZTV, which, as you say, is quite commonly applied to large-scale projects such as this. And you've included the Craig due to Inverarnan overhead line. Understand why. And explain a bit about the methodology. What struck me, and it may be my misunderstanding, but as we all know, the ZTV type analysis is unable to take account of trees, obviously, and any little lumps and bumps that fall below the resolution of whatever data set you're using, which I think was 10 metres on this occasion. So there will be some, it's obviously a worst case scenario, you know, a highest visible. What I wondered was, when you're just looking at a proposal, those features are obviously fixed. The trees are in one place, the bumps and bumps are in one place, so that's a constant. Whereas if you're looking at lots of different proposals, some of those might benefit more or less from those features in terms of screening. So is it not unfair, the fact that you can't take any account of those benefits, does that not potentially make your comparative assessment of those, potentially anyway, illegitimate? Line B might actually be far more benefiting of tree screening or whatever than line A, but you'll have no way of knowing that from simply looking at a bare ground ZTV. Is that fair?
In terms of the basic mathematics, yes, it is. Okay, but if you like, this is just the foundation of the analysis, if you like, simply to, and it's obviously commonly used by applicants, not just here and elsewhere, but so it's a starting point.
Yeah, I don't know as to whether it's ever used for comparing Scheme A with Scheme B when they are in very, very different locations for that reason. I don't know. I'm not trying to be clever.
No.
It's clearly used for assessing a scheme because it's a fixed unknown. But
Ms. Platt's gone on to consider the landscape and visual impact from a professional point of view. So if you like, she's taken it up to the higher level.
Absolutely, and we'll come on to that. Absolutely, I don't doubt that at all. But I'm just, in terms of the basic methodology, the foundation of it, I'm just suggesting might not be completely rock solid, but we'll come on to that.
The value of it, though, is that I've used the same digital elevation model for all comparisons. I've used the same terms, same specifications for the view shed, and ultimately, at the end of the day, this is about comparing the effects of the different alternatives, including the proposal, obviously. So in looking at the site before we undertake this analysis and in developing the alternatives, we're aware that there's some alternatives, if you like, that are running confined valleys, and therefore the visual spread is much more restricted. And there's others where it's not. And that's really the point of the analysis. But whilst it's far from a perfect technique, it's a comparative analysis here, and that, I think, has got value.
I agree with that, and it certainly can take account of valley level screening. What I'm saying is it might, and it is only a might, it might unfairly treat different locations because one happens to benefit more from trees or small bumps that simply can't be picked up. We don't know.
Yes, and we've done this at, as you said, 10 metres. There's actually terrain data available at 5 metres, but A, it was going to cost money to produce that. And frankly, we don't have the resources. But B, the computation we thought at this scale, and this was in discussion with Ms. Platt and myself, we felt that it was appropriate because we're not talking about a little site, if you like, where there's the immediate effects of properties and other things immediately around it. You know, we're not talking something at the scale of 100 or 200 metres or something like that. We are talking in terms of kilometres. So we felt at that scale the 10-metre separation was valid. there was also a time pressure issue as well, which was. But what we felt was that the applicant really hadn't covered this adequately, and obviously they've not covered it in terms of the alternatives that we were putting forward, perfectly fair. But in terms of putting forward the alternatives, we felt that this was appropriate to run something superficially equivalent to what should be undertaken for a proper assessment.
I don't know if you want to, I'm trying to think of a way you could easily indicate to me that you want to chip in. You probably don't know, but you're kind of behind my back at the moment, so I may not see if you're waving your hand, but so maybe just speak up, don't feel you're interrupting. If you want to add anything to the discussion, that's probably the easiest way. Just say something and then I can turn around and let you in, if that's okay. Did you want, while I'm looking at you, did you want to say anything on this particular point, or are you okay?
Yes, I can say something just regarding ZTV and the use of it within assessments generally, and how I would use that. That it is usually very much an indicative tool. It's never used in a literal way to suggest that one development is better or more suited than another, but it helps to indicate where the views might be from, where the extended view is, and obviously it helps to pinpoint where any viewpoints for a further assessment should be located. So I think the use of it is always a kind of a broad brush and an indicative tool, but it's a helpful pointer, and it helps to move forward the assessment, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if you want to come in again. You can if you wish. Most of my questions at this stage are directed towards those who produce the comparative analysis, but if you want to say anything, obviously let me know.
I think Mr. Brice might want to make a short comment.
Yeah, so I think we would accept that zone of theoretical visibility mapping as a valid tool, one of many that we may choose to use in this process, but with the caveat that it has significant limitations as set out by Ms. Platt, and we can provide some more detail on that, and my colleague Mr. Bainsfair can add to that as well, if that would be helpful. I think the fundamental point, though, is that, well, from my perspective, NMP is asking us to, well, essentially, what their assessment is showing, or they're adding to their assessment to say that each of their alternatives outside option 1 is less visible from the settlement of Dalmally. I'm not actually convinced that the viewshed analysis actually adds anything to the picture on that front. We can say that without the benefit of viewshed analysis, but we are considering things in the round and across a number of factors.
Okay, so you get from that, I think if I understand the methodology correctly, you get a surface area of potential visibility. We said some of it will be screened, but it's potential and it's consistent potential of visibility. But I'm not familiar, and it's perhaps just me, I'm not familiar with an approach that simply takes a figure for this area, surface area of visibility, because it doesn't take account of relative sensitivity of different locations. It's just simply an area. Is that, again, not potentially misleading? X square metres as opposed to Y square metres, and X is smaller, therefore necessarily better. It's quite a crude approach, if you don't mind me saying.
It's a starting point. It's not just the area affected, but also the level of effect. So in other words, it's quantifying the number of pylons that might be visible from a particular location. So in that sense, it's adding a bit more. But that, as Ms. Platt says, it's a starting point, really.
Okay, yeah, and I'm coming on to the number of pylons, because you then give a sort of weighting as to, if you can see X or 2X pylons, that's twice as bad as X. I understand the methodology. Is it fair to say none of this, and I appreciate you come on to it later, but none of this gives you a kind of qualitative view of, for example, how the pylons might sit in the landscape if they're subtly arranged around contours, or quite sensitively done as far as it can ever be done. The fact that you might see 3 that are arranged neatly around contours, as opposed to only 2 or 1 sitting on top of a hill, this methodology doesn't. It would inaccurately give greater benefit towards the 1, when in fact it might not necessarily qualitatively be better.
I'd agree with that, sir. I mean, essentially, this is a quantitative process, a fairly crude quantitative process, as a starting point. So we can tell where it's affected. It certainly, and this is where Ms. Platt would be involved in terms of assessing, and she has done, the qualitative aspect.
Fine, yeah. And I had a question about, you've used road and rail routes as a surrogate for habitation. Would you accept that there's quite a variety of sensitivity usually attributed to road users? At one end you've got motor tourists and cycle tourists who are absolutely intent on the surroundings, whereas on the other hand you've got the truck driver who isn't actually looking out of his window other than, you know, straight ahead, and he's got a deadline to reach. So generally speaking, it's quite a variety of sensitivity, whereas a centre of habitation is usually assessed as being higher, the highest sensitivity, you know, what you can see from your backyard or whatever is. So is it in fact really legitimate to, and I appreciate you go on subsequently to do a sort of qualitative analysis of things, but just in terms of this methodology, is it really legitimate to use road and rail links as a surrogate for habitation? Are they not something quite different?
Well, the reason for using it is really data. Accessing the data on the residential properties in the area is quite expensive. We don't have that kind of resources, and therefore I wanted to, if you like, consider the impact, if you like, on the human side. The data that we did have was obviously for the railways and the roads. That's fairly easy to access, and therefore I used it as a substitute. And in doing that, it wasn't just a casual, oh, there's no alternative kind of thing. I did give some thought to the level of concentration, if you like. If you go into urban areas, the density of roads to the density of dwellings is actually closely correlated. Okay, I've actually done some analysis on this in the past. A bit sad, but that's the way it is. But in this area, if you go into rural areas, the correlation between dwellings and roads isn't quite as intense. But my feeling was that in this remote area, where we obviously don't get dwellings on hills, and the area is very extensively covered by hills, in practical terms, the dwellings are fairly close to the roads. So in that sense, you don't get the concentration that you get with dwellings in terms of a village or a habitat or a settlement or something like that. But they are reasonably indicative of the and it's a crude indication of the habitation that's around here. And then there's the secondary consideration that the roads and the rail routes are you know, used by people. Yeah, so if you were carrying this through to the full scale, you'll do a residential impact assessment. It's not our job to do the applicant's job, with respect.
Oh no, and I'm certainly not criticising people who haven't done that. I'm just trying to work out
Sure.
how I can, or the extent to which I can rely on your sort of quantitative analysis,
Yep.
or as opposed to your qualitative analysis, which comes later with Ms. Platt.
Yep.
And I think you've said yourself, I think you're more relying upon that. This is the foundation, this is the basis for starting out, and then you've built upon that.
I just thought, since we've got the 5 alternatives and the proposal, that it was worth doing a quantitative calculation thing.
That was all the questions I had on the quantitative side. Ms. Platt, did you have anything, before we go on to sort of your judgments, etc., which we'll come to in a bit, but anything just on that side? I suppose it's more the work of Dr. Ford.
No, not particularly. I think we're all sort of agreeing on the fact that it's indicative, but it's a useful, perhaps extra layer of information to sit alongside the qualitative information. And I did find it was useful to provide a little bit more understanding of quite the extent of visibility, and I think it was something useful to bear in mind more than, as you say, something to make a judgment on separately.
Okay, thank you. Did the applicant, yes.
So can I check one point with Ms. Platt? And while she's described as a useful quantitative tool which the qualitative assessment will build upon, is there a limitation and a knock-on effect for the qualitative assessment because of the limitations in the quantitative data? In other words, for example, you may know how many towers are visible, but you don't know to what extent those towers are visible.
I think when I was working through the qualitative aspects, it was quite separate in a lot of ways to the quantitative, and it wasn't relying on the information produced by Dr. Ford. So really the two can sit apart, and I wasn't using his information to inform my information. So in that way, it's not relying on it at all.
So how would you know, for example, how many turbines would be visible from, a particular location? Was that just your professional judgment? If you weren't basing it on the ZTV or the viewshed?
Yes, I was basing it on viewing the maps and understanding the topography and an estimation. And as with all of this assessment at this stage, it's indicative, it's quite high level. And it was on the understanding of, if the development is moving through this area, what would the effects be on this type of landscape, on these resources, and in the approximation of which bits of settlement could see. It's mainly based on reading the maps and reading the topography, which within this area is quite defined and quite distinct. So it's quite easy to judge just from a map view as to where the extent of visibility would fall. And then the ZTV analysis really provided an extra layer of a bit of data so that it's easy to get a better understanding of that.
Yeah. Anything else?
There's quite a few points been made very helpfully in terms of the degree to which you can rely on ZTVs. As my learned friend discussed, there's a lack of detail about what actually is visible, and that's critical because in terms of making determinations about potential significant effects, that's obviously can be quite fundamental. The other part to this, notwithstanding the variability even with the data, of which there is tolerances as well, which can throw in variability, is also is this matter of sensitivity and how we know with any certainty about which of these quite sensitive receptors we're dealing with in both landscape and visual terms, how they would be affected. As with Ms. Platt, I take this as being these very early stage analysis. The degree to which one can rely on them, I think, is clearly open to discussion, because we don't have wireline images, we don't have visualizations and the usual trappings that you'd have for an assessment. Now, whilst that might be deemed to be something which belongs within detailed landscape and visual impact assessment, I think to make decisions about significance of effects at this stage, what it does is it brings forward the need for further information. And I think I'm not conscious of anything before the inquiry on any of the NMP alternatives that deals with that or creates comparisons. So I would caution when you're considering this, the weight you would give to it. It's not to say there isn't something valuable in doing a comparison, which is certainly the applicant has put forward before the PLI its own RAG assessment based on an approach which is understood to be early consideration, and I think that's all we've got is early consideration. So I'm sure that would be in your understanding anyway. And the other thing is as well in terms of, and we'll come to this I'm sure as we go through the remainder of the session in terms of the alternatives, is that one of the things I would expect nonetheless though is an understanding of the effects on special qualities of some of the alternatives where we're dealing with wildland and national parks, because that would be a fundamental red flag if we were going to affect a nationally important landscape.
Did you want to say anything in response to that, Ms. Platt?
Yes, I would agree with Mr. Bainsfair that this is an early assessment and it doesn't provide a full determination, and it was not intended to provide a full determination. But the purpose being to look at some of the nuance of whether these alternatives had any further interest in, would they be taken forward to further assessment, and a little bit of interrogation in terms of any that move through designated areas. Would they cause significant effects, or would they be viable if there were specific mitigations available. And all of that is, I agree, the special policies will be useful involvement, but time constraints and resources again played a part. So the idea being to just unpick some of the hardline boundaries of the designations and say, actually, could we move through those? Could the routes move through those? And just to assess one against another, but on quite a high level and broad brush assessment in some ways.
Thank you. Is there anything else from the applicant's side?
Well, I mean, just so understanding then what it is that Ms Platt's asking you, sir, to take from her evidence, I mean, and you quite fairly acknowledged the limitations, but at the end of the day, your assessment, well, appraisal, call it what you will, amounts to 4 pages in your main statement and 2 paragraphs in your rebuttal statement. So in truth, then, Ms Platt, does your consideration of these alternatives, the NMP alternatives, amount to an early consideration of potential options without seeking to invite the reporter to conclude that even from a landscape and visual perspective, these are reasonable alternatives? Because you simply don't have the data or the work to support any of that.
I think that's there's a challenge there, that how much work and how much time can go into this stage, and really it was about what can be produced within the time and the constraints available. So the idea being that this is an indication and this is a suggestion of where there is a little bit more nuance in terms of, well, this route could be viable and it would be worth taking to further assessment.
I'm understanding that as a yes, but the reporter will have his own understanding. Thank you.
You want to disagree with that was a yes?
I think it's to say that I feel that they're useful assessments, and that it gives the information that we were hoping, which is to suggest that there are alternatives and that they are worth taking forward for assessment.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Could I just jump in, sir, and just say the obvious point here is that the burden of proof here rests on the applicant, and obviously we're not going to take a full professional, probably takes many months, environmental impact assessment with highly qualified experts.
Yeah, nobody's criticising it. Well, I'm certainly not criticising you for not having done that. I don't think Mr Mackay is criticising you for not having done that. It's just, it is what it is, I think, is what we're saying. Okay, well, I'd like, if nobody's got anything else on the general methodology, to look at NMP's alternatives one by one. I was, I guess, relying upon the applicant, I think, explaining the criticisms that they have levelled. I've made a number of notes on them, but it's probably easiest simply for the applicants to explain in its own words why these are not reasonable alternatives, and give the chance for NMP to comment.
So, do you want us to take each alternative and...
If we do just each one, if you tell us what you don't like about alternative one, then we'll hand it back, and then we'll go on that basis. And don't forget to lean into the microphone.
Well, Mr Bruce will give the initial...
Sorry to interrupt you. Can we have NMP 14 in front of us all, so that we're all talking about the same thing?
Yeah, so just to be clear, we will be referring to our topic paper throughout, and the RAG assessment that lies there in section 5, starting shortly after paragraph 5.2.6 is the first table, which deals with NMP Alternative 1. Before we even start that, I think just reiterating that we don't consider any of these alternatives to be reasonable or relevant, because they are arguably, other than NMP Alternative 1, because they lie outside of the strategic search area that we defined in our routing process. So we haven't really gone into that in detail, and it's set out in our topic paper, so I don't feel we need to, unless that would be helpful. So NMP Alternative 1 is a route which essentially follows a similar alignment to our proposed development, but higher on the hill, traversing around to the tie-in with the Dalmally Windy Hill line. So we accept that actually we considered something similar in our own analysis, but we determined that upon analysis across the full suite of issues that we consider in the routing process, that it would not be preferred. So we didn't consider that exact route, but something similar. And the main issues that we ruled or decided to move away from an option higher on the hill come through in the analysis for NMP Alternative 1. So for natural heritage, I'll suggest we don't go through every line of our, but natural heritage designations, that alternative would cut across the special protection area designation 1. While we rate landscape and visual as an amber for both our proposed development and the NMP alternative, I think Ms Platt accepted herself that there's the potential for some increased visibility of the NMP alternative 1 by placing it higher on the hill. So in effect, all you achieve from that option is moving it slightly further away from the settlement. However, some of the good design that we would point to in terms of, again, referring back to the Halford rules, in terms of achieving backclothing, would be lost potentially with a route higher on the hill. In addition to that, the exposure of the line and the ancillary access tracks and so on very steep terrain would be significantly more prominent. Without visualising it, you can imagine the cut you would have to make into a hillside to achieve an access track across the hillside. There's a great number of water courses that would have to be crossed. So there's a number of factors that would feed into us saying that routing along the upper slopes would be counterproductive. And my colleague Mr. Stewart might want to add on the engineering challenges.
Thank you, Peter. As per my colleague Mr. Bruce, I'll look to focus on the key issues that we've identified with regard to this alternative, sir. Firstly, with alternative 1, we have highlighted that the alignment has 89.4% of its length above an elevation of 200 metres. I'll explain for this alternative, because this appears for a number of subsequent ones to hopefully set the scene and save me repeating myself later on. But as the elevation increases, sir, the ice loadings which can occur on the conductors increases due to the further exposure you get at increased elevation. This can result in either an increase in the steelwork required in the tower to give it additional strength, or indeed can require additional towers or shorter spans, which again necessitate increased towers. So in line with our engineering guidance set out within our routing guidelines, this will be ranked as red because of that increase in the steelwork or towers. And from our perspective, in line with our licence obligation, that increases the costs associated with this. And that is not economic in comparison to our preferred and proposed overhead line, which only has 6.9% of its alignment above that 200 metre elevation. Apologies, sir. Apologies, sir. Would you like me to start from the beginning there again? Of course, sir. So, as we're highlighting for the alternative 1, this alignment has 89.4% of its alignment above a 200 metre elevation. What this means is the ice loading that is applicable to the conductors increases above this elevation. And what that results in is either increased steelwork being required for these towers to give them additional strength to resist that ice loading, or indeed as requiring shorter spans and additional towers. Either way, this results in an increase in costs, and in line with our licence to be economic, this is not preferable to our proposed overhead line, which only has 6.9% of its alignment above a 200 metre elevation. In the interest of fairness, it is worth noting that both Alternative 1 and our proposed overhead line scored red on flooding. However, we do believe that we could position the towers in such a way to span the flooding areas and not risk the towers. So we applied that assumption to both elements. In terms of the construction maintenance and the actual operations themselves, the alignment that we've seen from NMP requires approximately 19 angle towers. Now, the angle tower, sir, is the stockier tower that you see, where the insulators are sitting almost horizontal, and they have the operation within the overhead line of holding the conductors up and in tension, and required to be more robust than their suspension counterparts because they have to resist overturning loads. When we introduce more angle towers, we see additional construction activity because we have more wiring sections to undertake. And we also increase the number of accesses. As my colleague Mr. Clark referenced earlier, we do need to maintain permanent accesses to these angle positions. So again, the cost will increase when you have more angle towers on your alignment. Just sticking with access tracks for a moment, it is worth noting that alternative 1, 17.9% of this alignment is within 1 kilometre of the access tracks. So fair to say the majority of this alignment is more than a kilometre away from existing access tracks, which means we have further construction to do to reach this. For comparison to the 2 points that I've just set out there, we only have 10 angle towers on our proposed alignment, and 44.3% of our proposed alignment is within 1 kilometre of existing access tracks. So again, bring it back to that economic condition of our licence. The proposed alternative 1 has greater numbers of angle towers, greater access tracks, does not compare favourably there. As a general observation that I would like to make on this one with regards to it being at a higher elevation, it is accepted that when you are at higher elevations, you do have a greater likelihood of exposure to poor and inclement weather. And that's something we have to factor in when we're considering the health and safety of our operatives, both during the construction and the operation of this overhead line. Exposure to inclement weather can result in increased risks of slips, trips and falls. Potential exposure to cold weather can result in hypothermia, vehicle accidents and stranding. That all has to be factored in as to whether we can eliminate or avoid this. And in that regard, our proposed alignment looks to mitigate these in a better way. I would now hand back to Mr. Bruce to talk about alternative route 2.
I'll go back. I think we'll do it one by one. I think we'll, if that's all you want to say about option 1.
The only thing I would add, sir, is, and I think you're probably aware of this, but Appendix 3 to the topic paper includes wire lines related to each of the alternatives. And so far as NMP Alt 1 is concerned, the aspect that you'll be invited to observe there is the increased prominence because of the fact that the power line would according to that suggestion, be routed further up the hillside. And these are obviously the same visualisations, or same viewpoints rather, that were of concern to the local authority.
I'm assuming nobody's questioning the accuracy of those wire lines that the applicants produced for your proposals, Ms. Pyatt?
No, I'm not questioning the accuracy of those. I take those on face value, as with the other viewpoints and representations. Okay, so possibly a question more for Dr. Ford, but obviously I'm going to ask you what you say in response to all of that. One thing that struck me from conversation, I think it was yesterday, we had about eagles. They don't know where the boundary of an SPA is, but surely putting the line into their heartland isn't a great idea. Even if they don't stay there, you're going to find them more often within the SPA than out with it. Is that not true?
It is, sir, but you have to go back to how the boundary of the SPA was designated. It's very obvious if you look at the map, sir, that essentially this spur that comes out to the northwest corner of it is going between woodland. And not suggesting there's any way that the designation is not inappropriate or the boundary is not appropriate. But it's very clear, and I understand this, Ms. Platt has personal knowledge of it, that actually the boundaries reflect the land ownership issues rather than the boundaries that the eagles fly to. So with respect to the applicant, we take the point that technically is within the designation, but the boundaries themselves are, not just concerned with protecting the eagles, but also the history of the land ownership. Can I just pick up one other point, sir?
Please do.
The applicant's referring to angle towers. The impression is that we have decided the route. We've fixed the pylons as to where they should be. That's not the level that we're working at here. We haven't said you've got to put this pile in here, that pile in there. The level that we're working at is that we are proposing a corridor, essentially. And we're not suggesting that this represents the finalised route. And therefore, these issues about angle towers are really, to that level of that next stage in the process. What we're doing at this stage is outlining a broad corridor to be followed. We thought it was worth considering this option primarily because it takes the proposal away from the habitation in the area. Accept the point about over 200 metres height and the requirement for slightly increased towers. Again, in terms of access tracks, that is really the product of the routing process, the final routing process. So there are actually some access tracks available through the forestry in particular. So there are existing access tracks that can be followed. But the final requirement in terms of access tracks really depends on the finalised route, and therefore at this stage of just looking at a corridor, we don't think that's appropriate. I can turn over to Ms Platt in terms of the qualitative aspects.
Ms Platt? What I was quite sorry to interrupt. I was quite interested in as I understand it, the benefit to Dalmally is it's further away, but it appears it's more visible potentially from the village. Is that fair?
There's potential for increased visibility, which my main concern was it removes it from the lower slopes and moves it up into the kind of hinterland of the open zone and the wild zone, which is visibly from the loch area is different and it's distinct. And as I say, this is all indicative, but my initial thoughts were that there would be potential further effects on the APQ from this area, but that the distance from settlement, from strategic routes and from historic resource were all positives and all weighed in the favour of this route. Ultimately, without further interrogation and without producing and analysing those viewpoints, it's difficult to say definitively. But my initial thoughts were that there were potential increased adverse effects visually from this particular alternative.
Thank you. I wonder if I could just ask the applicant to clarify how they came to the conclusion about the number of angle towers, etc. What was the methodology for that?
So I was just going to go back to Mr Ford as well on that point. An angle tower doesn't just represent a change of direction, it also represents a change of elevation. So if we're going up over a hill, regardless of if it's 50 metres to the right, 50 metres to the left, you still have to go up the hill. So you would have an angle tower, at the top of the hill, and as it contours over that slope, you have additional angle towers. So it's not simply deviating 30 degrees or 40 degrees off an angle. So that's basically how we've calculated it, taking approximately the changes of direction and the changes of elevation. And just a point on the access tracks, yeah, we have taken account of the existing access tracks when we've looked at each of these alternatives, and the figures that we are providing are based on distances from existing access tracks. So we've taken that into consideration in all the options.
Does that answer your question or your criticism?
It does, sir. Can I just raise a minor procedural point? Could we lift the blinds, please?
One final question, and I know it's ballpark, but I think you tried to have a guess as to cost implications of all the various different routes. So I just wonder if you have it to hand, I think you'd kind of guesstimated comparative costs of the different options, and maybe if you could just share that with us.
Yes, sir. For alternative one, there's a cost difference of 2.58 million calculated between the two. It is worth noting, however, we did clarify within our alternatives topic paper that we do not account for additional steelwork strengthening, additional access tracks, and different foundation types that may be required for these alternatives. Based on the analysis we've conducted, we have assumed they're using the same rate as our own proposed overhead line.
Could I just ask, is it possible to get us as a percentage rather than just an actual cost?
Not at this moment.
Is that because we don't know what the cost of the current scheme is, or is that not public knowledge? Or
no, sir. It's just it hasn't been calculated in the topic paper, and we would need to get the calculator out, which I'm sure Dr. Ford could do as well.
No mind if we don't want. I can do that myself. I can't recall the cost of your. If I know it, I can't recall what the cost of your proposal is.
Our base cost, sir, is set out as 61.85 million, and for comparison, alternative 1 is 64.42 million.
It's page 51 of the topic paper, sir.
Familiar with that table now. Anything else on option 1 that we haven't already covered? Ms. Platt, did you want to say anything? I think have you covered everything you wanted to say?
Yes, and I think I'd reiterate Dr. Ford's comments on the SPA and the eagles, that it's an unusual designation boundary in this area, and really it reflects that the forestry areas which the proposal cuts through in effect would be part of that if they were owned by a different landowner. So it's quite a nuanced designation.
Okay. Dr. Ford, anything else on applicant side? Anything else before we move on to number 2?
Just on the SPA point, I don't think it actually adds a lot to get into potential debate about whether there may not be eagles using that particular part of the SPA. We don't actually have the data to say one way or another before the inquiry. In any event, I think we're not considering routing decisions on the basis of any one parameter here. We're looking across the piece. And in actual fact, for NMP Alt1, there's some nuanced differences on the landscape and visual, which are arguably, I would accept, arguably more important in this case than the SPA. The other alternatives are more of an issue for the SPA. And then the engineering and cost considerations are very considerably in favour of the proposed development over NMP Alternative 1.
I understand. So, yeah, when something's coloured bright red, you can't jumps out as that's very important, but in fact it just means it's a negative in that box. You've got to take the whole thing, all the considerations. Fine. Shall we do option 2 before lunch? I think we've probably got time to do that. Shall we? I'll look to your side. Tell me what you think is not comparable on option 2.
Okay, so NMP Alternative 2A and 2B. So I'm referring to our Table 4, which is on page 37 of our topic paper, which highlights again in the red, amber, green the key issues. Natural heritage designations, I think it's important, whilst we've had the discussion about the section that Alternative 1 cuts across as potentially being less sensitive, it's more to do with land ownership. I think I would hope, Dr. Ford and Ms. Platt may well agree that this option would be cutting through much more of the core area of known eagle territories. So we would have, whilst we're not suggesting that mitigation is impossible, it would place significant constraint in our weighing of the issues. When we have a much better or an opportunity to go around the SPA, this would weigh quite heavily in the balance to suggest we shouldn't be going through the SPA. On the landscape and visual point of view, the key point is you're quite quickly moving into a nationally important wildland area, which again is flagged as a red flag under the following our routing guidance and methodology. And then I'll just remind myself, but I think the very end of the route, that certainly 2A dips into the national park. So again, that's a red flag, albeit it's a very short section into the national park. Colleague Mr. Bainsfair may want to add a little bit to my analysis on the specifics of what would be. Well, we've already covered it. It would be inappropriate to draw any conclusions on the significance of impact without having actually prepared a wildland assessment and looked at the special qualities. But Mr. Bainsfair may wish to add to that.
Just a brief point, sir. Yeah, I looked at the wildland when we were considering the RAG assessment, as we would call it, red, amber, green, and specifically around the description of the wildland area that a number of the alternatives bisect. Now, I appreciate, Ms. Platt's quite correct within the description. It does talk about the influence of the dam at Shearer. However, when looking more in the round at the wildland area and how that's experienced, the progression through, that influence diminishes as you walk through that valley feature up towards the national park. So we're talking about not only the effect on the wildland area, but also its role in the anticipation of transferring into the national park as well. So it's just really, it's for your benefit, sir, just to state that it's not just about a localised impact within that part of the wildland. It's actually the transition through that wildland. This is standard consideration from Nature Scots guidance, and certainly my experience in considering wildland impacts.
I'll now move on to the engineering considerations, sir. Following much same topics as previous. For alternative 2A, it is worth noting that the maximum elevation is 422 metres above ordnance data, and in this instance 99.4% of this alignment is above 200 metres elevation. For 2B, the maximum elevation is 431 metres above ordnance data, and 99.2% of the alignment is above 200 metres elevation. Looking at the angle towers, 2A requires approximately 36 angle towers to facilitate it. And we also have 11.3% of the alignment being within 1 kilometre of existing access tracks, again, meaning the majority is out with that 1 kilometre limit. For 2B, we have 31 angle towers and 12% of the alignment is within 1 kilometre. So again, the majority is further away than that. My points again stand on the economic implications as well as the health and safety observations that I made previously. One additional general observation I'd like to make, sir, is with regard to the route that has been taken, we note that it crosses the toe of the Lochy Dam. It is something that would require significant further investigation. We would not recommend any excavations or installation of our infrastructure at the toe of a dam for obvious reasons. And we'd just like to highlight as a general observation on the suitability of this route. And sorry, sir, to confirm the costs as well associated with these. For alternative 2A, it has a cost of 90 million or 90.1 million. So that is a 28.26 million uplift on our proposed overhead line. And for alternative 2B, it is 85.11 million, so a 23.26 million uplift in our proposed overhead line.
Start with Dr. Ford. Anything you want to say about those criticisms of alignment 2 and A and B?
Well, the first point to say is that obviously overhead lines already run through the wildland area. The Spen overhead line obviously goes through the area. And the second thing is, in terms of access tracks, I've not done the calculation, but superficially from looking at the mapping, the 11% of access tracks within 1 kilometre, within 1 kilometre of an access track doesn't seem right to me. There is an access track all the way along the Glen Reservoir. I know because I've been on it. We've been to the other end, and actually to the point where Route 2A and 2B split. So all of that has got infrastructure and all of that got an access track. I'm not suggesting that's adequate for your equipment by modern standards, but there is a track there. In terms of the dam footings and so on, we're not suggesting precise locations for pylons, and I'd be surprised if you can't get a pylon, get an overhead line through there. And of course, there are existing overhead lines going to the foot of the dam.
Okay, I had a couple of questions that occurred to me on the wildland point. First, just because there are intrusions that reduce the sense of wildness doesn't mean that adding more is a good idea. You're going to exacerbate that problem, surely.
Yeah, it's a fair point, sir. And obviously, it's an overhead line, and therefore it's something at up to 50 metres. But actually, having been there, we were actually quite surprised that you don't really get a sense from the mapping of how much there is, I forget the terminology, but human structures, is it something like that? So actually, that upper Glen area is actually very heavily dominated, and we've critiqued the appropriateness of the wildland designation, if you like, in that location because of the element, the level to which it affects the integrity of it. Just in terms of one thing, thinking ahead, sir, it may be that you want to go there.
That was my other point. I haven't been there, so I have a long list of other places to visit, so I will include that in the...
Just in terms of access, there is a gate before you get to the first dam, which is over a bridge, and you need the codes to get through the gate. You can't just walk round it. Okay, but we can arrange for something like that.
Oh, sorry, you're looking in my direction. This isn't a gate over which I could jump. No, okay, it's a big one. The deer fence type gate, yeah.
There are lots and lots with lots of codes. It's actually quite an interesting exercise, but all you need is the code.
Ms. Pratt, did you want to say anything about alternative 2A and B?
Yes, I think this is quite an interesting one because there was an impression that this area had been ruled out based on the lie of the designations on the land, and the interest was whether the site-specific conditions and whether there were mitigations which would mean that this wasn't quite as much of an issue in terms of development as it looked on the outset. I think that the wildland designation is, from my point, was the key one, and rightly Mr. Baines says it would need a wildland assessment, which we haven't undertaken. But the interest was with the interventions at Lochy, whether there were potential mitigations with the development which could further reduce and make that acceptable. My feeling is that it would always be quite a significant development, but with mitigation and the combination of the existing development, that might not be as much of an issue as seen on the outset when just looking at it purely as a wildlands area. Certainly, the site visit revealed that the area around Lochy and then moving north up to B had potential. Moving further in along to A, I had the impression, created the feeling of moving further into the fully wild zone, and as mentioned before, moving towards the national park area. So our preference was to maybe look at route 2B as the preferred option. And I think the other impression and the indication within the assessment was that a significant amount of the other adverse effects from the current proposal were reduced to a very large degree, and that there may be a balance there between the potential to mitigate the effects on the wildlands area and the vast reduction in adverse effects on the other landscape qualities. So it was an interesting one, and I think it certainly showed the potential for a much more detailed assessment on that route.
Thank you. Anything else you want to say on options 2, Alt 2?
If I may, sir. Just coming back to the Lochy Dam, there are in fact, there's a lock-in immediately to the southwest of Lochshire, excuse my pronunciation, Loch and Seanmore, and the routing actually is very close to that lock-in, and then it's obviously coming close to the dam. There is all the power station equipment and buildings in there as well. We'll probably come on to that more for alternative 3, but there is other equipment other than just the dam, and so it's quite a narrow strip of land.
Sorry, sir. In addition, we just want to address one point with regards to the wildland. There is obviously the existing Scottish Power overhead line that runs through there. Yep. We just want to highlight that extends from Cruachan, which was constructed at the tail end of the 1950s, early 1960s. So its place within the wildland obviously predates its designation, and we would not take that as a precursor for us being able to go and develop a further overhead line in that area. Yeah.
Okay, shall we break for lunch? No? Somebody else? Sorry, Ms. Platt, I can't see the waving. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add just one point regarding the mitigation. I sort of skipped over. Really, that was in relation to whether undergrounding could be an option here. And I mentioned that, and it was referred to as obviously not looking at the engineering, but from a visual side, the lack of tree cover in this area means that there's potential there for undergrounding without creating a clear corridor. Obviously, the access would be still a requirement, and I appreciate the peat may be a big issue, but it did offer a good potential for that being along this route.
I think, sir, just to note on that, as Ms. Platt picks up, there would be impacts on peatland. I'm sure my colleague Mr. Bruce can add to that. I think, again, just coming back to our licence condition to be economic, we have already demonstrated for this particular alternative that it is substantially more expensive than our proposed overhead line. If we were to introduce sections of underground cable, the only direction those costs can travel in is up. And would that be reasonable for us to do that when we have a more economic, efficient and coordinated proposal already available to us? Yes, out with the wildland area to boot.
Okay, we'll break now until 2 o'clock. Yes, until 2 o'clock, and we'll continue with option 3. Thank you. We've already talked about, unless there's anything different, I don't think there is, so maybe we'll concentrate on the bit that goes up Glen, maybe is that the difference between the earlier scheme and this? Maybe ask for the applicant's comments first.
Yes, sir. So I think before we move into our environmental and engineering assessments of alternatives 3 and 4, we wanted to highlight that there are some, I suppose, perhaps misunderstandings of the network configuration in this area and how that potentially impacts on the viability of these alternatives. So firstly, it's been noted by No More Pylons that they have identified that what they're classing as a 275 kV overhead line runs between our 132 kV Inverarnan switching station and the 132 to 220 kV Crossegg substation. What we would like to clarify is that the overhead line that runs between these two sites is capable of operation at 275 kV, in that the towers, the conductors and the insulators all allow that. However, currently, the way it is connected to 132 kV apparatus, it can only operate at 132 kV. And we do clarify this in section 2.5.2 of our initial needs case, that's core document 10.12, which states that the approved scope for the Inverarnan Crosshague OHL was to rebuild the line to 275 kV specification to be initially operated at 132 kV. I think it's worthwhile then leading on just to note that we did set out in our alternatives topic paper at paragraph 5.2.96 the additional infrastructure we have identified as required to allow the alternatives 3A, 3B, 4A and 4B to operate at 275 kV and to connect the required generation. So in summary, what we would need to see is the Craigdhu substation move to broadly within the vicinity of Inverarnan. That would allow the 275 kV network to leave from there, but also to connect to the existing 132 kV network, maintaining connection to existing demand and generation customers up to Tainault. As we discussed earlier, that connection to the 132 kV network is also critical to allow load to be drawn off that network and create capacity for the first phase of this 275 kV upgrade. And that 132 kV connection point at Craigdhu is also required for future onshore wind generation connections. Normal Pylons did propose that a hard T arrangement could be used at this end, but that is only applicable at the same voltage to which the line you're connecting into. So in that instance, that does not account for the 132 kV connection. So we wanted to make these clarifications because I understand rebuttals that Normal Pylons had not necessarily accepted these amendments were required. I want to highlight these before we moved into our environmental and engineering considerations, sir.
Well, sir, Mr. Stewart went through that very quickly, and it's new, or at least new to me.
I don't think it is new.
That is correct, sir. It is not new.
It's not new.
Been set out in our
buried
alternatives
away,
paper.
and he just went through it very quickly. I wonder if I could ask him to either try and summarise it or go through it again, so I have a careful note of it. Would you mind?
Yeah, if it's done quickly. And while you're doing that, can I just ask, in terms of how this effectively this new substation, or new switching station, whichever it is, this new piece of kit, would that need to be immediately adjacent to the existing Inverarnan substation, or could it be anywhere, somewhat remote from that?
We had assumed, sir, it would be broadly within the vicinity of Inverarnan, but not immediately adjacent to the existing Inverarnan switching station.
Call you saying that actually constructing it may not be necessarily that straightforward where it is. But, could you just summarise kind of what you just told me? I know it is in your documents, but
yes,
perhaps
sir,
buried in there, but it is in there.
To summarise, we are clarifying that it would not be possible to run a 275 kV overhead line out of the 132 kV Inverarnan switching station. To do so, you would need to introduce Craigdhu at a new location in the vicinity of Inverarnan and create connections into the 275 kV overhead line and into the existing 132 kV network in order for that alternative to function as required. And we have set this out in paragraph 5.2.96 of our alternatives topic paper.
Should we deal with that, Dr. Ford? You don't dispute any of that? I assume the technicalities.
To me, it's an issue. Please confirm for me, because this only became apparent in your rebuttals. So, in a sense, whilst it's not absolutely fresh, this information wasn't really evident in your application in the core documents. So our alternatives were propositioned on some presumptions about what was happening to the circuits.
Yeah, I think it's a bit unfair to criticise them, and they only put it in to respond to something that you'd raised.
Yeah, no, I accept that, sir. But one thing that isn't quite clear from what you're saying is that the Inverarnan to Crosshague line currently under construction will initially operate at 132, but as soon as you've done the associated works with that, which relate to, my understanding is to different substations down that line, if you like, that you will fairly quickly move it up to 275 kV, and that the intention of that circuit from Inverarnan down to Crosshague is actually that it becomes a fairly high capacity 275 kV line.
The Inverarnan to Crossay line is, as of last weekend, is fully energised at 132 kV and is in operation, and all the substation connections to it are currently at 132.
But that quite wasn't what my question. My question is, at some point, my understanding is that you're going to uprate this and do it. There is no more construction work to be done on the line itself. I don't know about the associated works into the substations, but my understanding is what you've just built and just energised could operate at 275.
The overhead line will be able to operate at 275 kV with modifications required. So the first element we need to do is construct a substation at Crossay at the southern end, capable of transforming the voltage to 275 kV. The end that connects into Inverarnan under our wider plan, sir, will be removed, and that line will ultimately connect into Craigdhu to enable its full 275 kV operation, where you have that equipment at either end.
Can I just ask a point of clarification? You're doing the connection between Craigdhu and the existing line via a tie-in to the west. My understanding is to the west of where the current switching station is, on the western side of the A819. What are you doing to the voltage in terms of getting down to 132? Do you not need to do that anymore, or because is the switching station at Inverarnan going to be removed altogether, or is this? My understanding is that actually it's been retained. So is there some link between the 275 as planned as you envisaged and the 132 at Inverarnan? Because obviously Inverarnan is connected across to Sloy and to Inverarnan at 132 at the moment. So, and I'm not sure it's a grid supply point as well.
Inverarnan will be maintained as a 132 kV switching station following the full 275 kV scheme being energised.
But that quite wasn't my point. My point is, are you connecting between the intended 275, if you like, coming all the way from Crossay to Craigdhu and onwards, to the Inverarnan switching station?
The 275 will connect from Crossay. The substations en route, those being Ansui, Crera and Craigmorrell, will operate at 275 kV, and that line will subsequently terminate at Craigdhu. In the interim, there is a 132 kV connection that runs between Inverarnan and Craigdhu. However, following the full 275 kV energisation, it is proposed that line would be removed. The 132 kV connection between Craigdhu and Tainault would be maintained.
I think that's about as much information on that as I think is relevant to what we're talking about now. Can we go on just to your...
With respect, so I think there's just one thing that came out at the end there. Are you leaving the existing 132 kV line between Inverarnan and Tainault in place? I appreciate you putting the Craigdhu substation in, but the section, if you like, between Craigdhu and Inverarnan switching station, is that staying? My understanding was that the connection between, and I'm quite happy to be persuaded, told I'm wrong, is that the 275 line coming from Craigdhu down to Inverarnan is a replacement from the between that section.
Yes, the 132 kV overhead line that exists from Inverarnan and currently runs straight to Tainault, when it is split at Craigdhu and following the introduction of the 275 kV line, we will remove the overhead line that operates at 132 from Craigdhu down to Inverarnan.
So how are you getting the 132 into Inverarnan?
We still maintain connections from Sloy and Inverarnan.
So there's nothing west of it and south of it?
I'll defer to my colleague Douglas Hill, but there's no further connections that Mr Hill is indicating.
I think you answered the question.
I'm not convinced this is massively relevant to what I need to consider. It might be very interesting, but I think, can we just move on to your assessment of this options 3 and A and B?
Thank you, sir. So, our environmental analysis of NMP options 3A and B, as you correctly point out, at the point where they join Lochy and Shira, we've largely discussed those sections. We don't need to go over that again. And setting aside the fact that they don't actually work on a technical basis, of course, they originate in the Inverarnan switching station, and in that initial section they're starting in the Inverarnan Castle design garden landscape, which is the first point of concern. The route on a sort of north-northeast direction into an upland Glen landscape, which, albeit it's a local concern, but it's one of the issues that Argyll and Bute Council come back to routinely as one of the landscapes that they seek to protect from development. And then finally, before you get to the section we've already covered, you're transecting through the Glen Shira Special Area of Conservation, which is noted in its citation as an extremely important woodland habitat. And very, very rare. So I just think, from our perspective, it's a non-starter.
And picking up on the engineering concerns for this one, sir, again highlighting for 3A, 66.1% of the alignment is above 200 metre altitude, and for 3B, 63.9% is above 200 metres. In terms of the angle towers required, we have 45 for alternative 3A and 40 for alternative 3B. 6.7% of the alignment is within 1 kilometre of access tracks, and 7.1% is within 1 kilometre of access tracks for alternative 3B. It's also worth highlighting alternative 3A, we identified 10 buildings, not necessarily residential dwellings, but 10 buildings within 100 metres of the alignment, and 3B also identified the same number of buildings. As a comparison, our proposed overhead line has no buildings within 100 metres of its proposed alignment at this moment in time.
Do the comparative costs, just to finish off.
Of course, sir. So within our alternatives topic paper, we have taken these as a direct comparison from their starting points. Alternative 3A incurred a cost of £101.28 million, so a £39.44 million uplift in our costs. And alternative 3B had a cost of £96.57 million, so a £34.73 million increase in costs.
Thank you. In terms of should I want to go there, am I right in thinking I could get up Glen Shira, I just can't go beyond the dam? Is it accessible up to that point? Do you know?
It's fairly close to the first dam, yes. I think you're about, I don't know, half a kilometre or something like that.
The access problem is at the dam and beyond, is that right?
There's a boundary line which I think follows a steep stream burn kind of thing, and the bridge is over that, if you like. It's not an insignificant bridge, I have to say. I'm not saying it's a huge bridge, but it's probably the width of this room that it's covering, and it's got, it's obviously been it's a fairly substantial structure. Actually, it's not a temporary structure. It's obviously, well, I presume it was built for the power infrastructure, the hydro scheme being built. But as you rightly observed, it's got a deer fence on it, and the gate is 10 foot high.
So again, just one other factor that Mr. Clark will explain by reference to the technical clarifications that Mr. Stewart gave earlier.
Yeah, sorry, sir. It's just to clarify the costs, and we took on board the feedback from NAP in the rebuttal, and looking at the aspects of the scope that would be required for these alternatives to be made to work. So the figures in terms of the costs for 3A, the additional cost would actually be 23.63 million, and for 3B it'd be 18.92. Now we've assessed all these options on a like-for-like basis, not taking into account what we spoke about earlier about ice loading, number of angle towers, extra access tracks. We've just used a flat standard rate. We would expect that rate to increase for the steeper slope sections. and obviously no underground in any of them.
Do you want to go first? Do you want to come back on any of those points, Dr. Ford?
Just in terms of your costing up, confirm or otherwise, please. Are you using the kind of, you'll see in my rebuttal, I put a table 1 comparison of cost, which is purely based on length, using your 4.65 million per kilometre. Are you adding things on top of that as well, or are you simply working to that ratio?
I'm working exactly to the 4.65 million as a standard rate across all the options.
Okay.
In that calculation.
Thank you.
All what we've simply done is looked at the aspects that hadn't been accommodated for. We'd offset them against Craig to Inverarnan.
Yeah. Okay. So, sir, whilst I think there's some dispute about the actual precise lengths, our table 1 in our rebuttal gives comparative costs.
I'm not sure that it does, because it's just deducting Inverarnan to Craigdhu from our figures, when in fact you haven't allowed for the infrastructure to make the connections from the existing line, 275 line, the existing 132 line, and to bring over the NMP proposal from the Inverarnan switching station to the new proposed Craigdhu substation. So you need to add in all those additional lengths of line, which we believe comes to, as a crow flies distance, about 5.5 kilometres.
Which is why I was querying you earlier on, because I don't think this is actually clear, and despite the explanation earlier on, sir, and I appreciate you don't want to dwell on it, but I don't think that evidence is clear before the inquiry, I'm afraid.
I think it is now. Would you accept? If you're doubting what he's saying is true,
no, I still am unclear about what's actually happening, is the reason. And I've taken a fair amount of time to understand what's happening. The applicant has been enough to give us GIS data on their existing infrastructure in this area, so we've spent a fair amount of time on it. And I'm not saying there are not genuine issues here, but I mean, I don't, for example, understand why there's a new pylons gone in west of Inverarnan switching station going due west, because it sounds like you're going to remove them later.
Sir, if I may politely draw your attention to paragraphs 5.2.96 through to 5.2103 of our alternatives topic paper, where we clearly set out the amendments we believe would have been required for alternatives 3 and 4 to function.
Is that sufficiently clear? We're not talking about exact figures. I'm just trying to get a ballpark for relative costs, taking into account all reasonable things. And there's quite a few things that they haven't taken into account, which they've mentioned. But you satisfied, very broadly, it's in the right kind of ballpark.
I would like to understand precisely what's happening in the network, so before I make a commitment on that or observation on that. One thing that is obvious is that the applicant does accept that these routes are technically viable. I'm not saying they technically prefer them, but I'm really thinking in terms of what's happening in and around Inverarnan. I'm not talking about the general principle of the route. I'm talking about the way these connect.
Would you concede they are technically viable?
It has been a high-level assessment we have undertaken, sir. I think we have identified significant concerns and constraints that are associated with all of the NMP alternatives. And as such, I would maintain our position that our proposed overhead line offers the least constrained and most economic efficient solution that we can provide.
Can I ask, Ms. Platt, from your professional view, what's your conclusions on options 3A and 3B and relative merits compared with the proposal?
So, as mentioned, similar to options 2A and 2B, in that option 3 contains effects upon historic resource, effects upon strategic routes, and effects upon settlement to a much higher degree. Option 3, looking specifically at the lower portion, prior to reaching Glen, Lochy, is particularly contained visually because of the topography, but I would agree that it has additional impacts on ancient woodland and a slightly higher landscape value. I think again it doesn't contain effects in that way as successfully as option 2, but it's the same outcome of potentially some of the effects of the proposal are mitigated whilst there are different effects on the landscape, and it's an interesting balance where I felt that a full assessment may come out with similar outcomes but on different bits of landscape resource.
Thank you. Did you want to, Mr. Linsfair, anything on that? Do you want to come back?
Not great. I'm not going to add much to that other than to say that, I mean, my position on the wildland area is clearly stated. The options extending along Glen Shira have not insignificant issues in relation to landscape sensitivity. The containment of visibility, there is one aspect of that I would like to comment on, which is I think that the concentration has been upon visual amenity within the Glen. But we are in an area which is known and well celebrated for summits, for instance, and certainly the appreciation of the wildland and connections into the national park are there, and these are promoted connections as well on hill walking sites, etc. So this is not an insignificant matter. So the fact that there may be a degree of visual containment doesn't mean to say there aren't significant potential effects on landscape character and designations.
Are you saying that one of the sort of promoted routes up into the hills would be up Glen Shira? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, there's connections through from Glen Shira. Obviously, it's a fairly key tourist area because of Inverarnan. And walks up through the Glen and up into the wildland area, notwithstanding some of the effects associated with the dam and with but this is a way up into the wildland and across to the national park, and the summits are identified specifically even within the wildland description as being a key asset as well. So there's even at this early stage, without drilling down into this, there are a number of what I would deem to be red flags.
Did you want to come back on any of that, Ms. Platt?
It's difficult without further interrogation. My initial assessment, I did feel that there were less kind of localised encounters, less opportunities for people to encounter the development up close. There's certainly no promoted routes up. It is accessible, but it's not popular. And the interior of the wildland area isn't easily accessible, and it certainly isn't frequented that much, whereas the proposed development is in proximity to core paths. It's highly visible from summits such as Succoth. I will accept that the proposed route you may see from Ben Louis, you may see from some of the other adjacent mountains. So I can't say whether one is with less opportunity for view than the other, but I would say that my initial thoughts were that more people, more receptors would encounter the proposed route than these options.
Thank you. Dr. Ford, anything? Yep.
A couple of points. Just on this point about the high ground and the peaks. Obviously, there's a wind farm really northwest of the top end of Loch Fyne, which is obviously affecting the southern area. I think another point just to generally point out is that of all the options before you, sir, and I'm not trying to give them equivalent status, 3B is the shortest route that you have before you. And that is based on the proposition of replacing not just the proposal, but also the Craigdhu to Inverarnan section. Our table presents comparison not just against the proposal, but also against the proposal and the Craigdhu to Inverarnan section.
How significant is being the shortest? If it's not the least harmful, I'm not saying it isn't, but is short in itself that much? If it's the most expensive, or it's more expensive and potentially more harmful, or even equally harmful, does it matter if it's the shortest?
The applicant's been very strongly emphasising cost is a driving issue, so that's the reason. My overall view is that these have to be balanced in terms of, given kind of broad acceptance that the engineering solutions can deliver something satisfactory. This is essentially a trade-off between the economics and the environment.
Well, yeah, but my point is this is about 50% more expensive if you believe the applicant's evidence, despite being shorter. Being short doesn't seem to help on the cost front.
Yes, and that's why we're concerned about what's happening at Inverarnan, which seems to be a key driver to those costs. And with respect, this has not been clear from the applicant previously. I appreciate it's in their responses, but I think we've said in our rebuttal that those statements are not clear. When I saw them, I spent several hours actually trying to read them and reread them and trying to understand exactly what was said. I got to the point of asking Mr. Campbell to give me his reading of it. And we really couldn't make the conclusions that the applicant is trying to suggest here, because, and I'm not suggesting there's any malintent here, but I just don't think the wording is clear and the implications are clear, which is why I'm really concerned to understand what they are doing here. I mean, in our rebuttal submission in Figure 1, we've shown you new pylons that are just built in the last couple of years on the circuit that's just been energised. I appreciate it's at 132 kV, but my understanding is the circuit just there is capable, and the pylon there is capable of taking 275. So we don't feel as though we have concluded, grounded out this issue about what the extra costs are in and around Inverarnan switching station.
I thought I'd understood it, but now I don't have a PhD in engineering, so now I'm starting to doubt myself. But do you understand what Dr. Ford's concerns are, and is there anything you can say in any clearer terms that might satisfy his queries?
If I can maybe ask the question back, is your query around the towers coming out of Inverarnan substation, the Inverarnan switching station that have just been replaced, heading down to Crossacre? Is that the query, that section of towers?
Yeah, my understanding is that you brought that line to just west of Inverarnan switching station. It lands at the moment, and I fully appreciate that, at the switching station, that's at 132. But it sounds to me, or it looks to me, having actually seen it, because I have seen it, that the scale of those pylons is sufficient to carry 275. So I don't understand why, for alternatives 3 and 4, you can't do a tie-in to that, and why you are requiring a substation. It sounds to me, and I think this is just a genuine lack of clarity here, and to be frank, I'm trying to help in terms of understanding it, but it sounds to me like the line, the 132 line that has come out the western side of the switching station at Inverarnan is going to be removed at 132, and to me, the proposition of the alternatives 3 and 4 is that you can actually tie into that existing, currently 132, energised last week, but capable of 275, immediately west of the switching station. So I don't really understand the associated works with it that you're saying are generating the cost. I'm just genuinely trying to understand it.
Okay, so first of all, the purpose of that new line primarily was asset replacement, because the existing line was in very poor condition, as exemplified by the section down at Crossegg that in 2013 the storm blew over. So that project.
But just quickly, is it not increasing capacity on that through the entire peninsula?
It has it has the capacity to be increased, yes, when it goes to 275.
You don't need to restring it, do you?
Sorry, no. Mr. Clark was developing his train of thought. I wonder if Dr. Ford can just allow him to finish his statement.
Thank you. So that line, when it is then upgraded to 275 use, it can carry higher capacity. However, the urgent need was to replace the existing 132 line that was in very poor condition, hence it had to be replaced from Inverarnan all the way to Crossegg. The option, the projects that are now being developed and put forward weren't in final state of readiness to confirm where that tie-in point would be on that line. However, the tie-in point could never be Inverarnan's switching station because it's a 132 kV switching station. Your proposal for your option 3 to tie into that existing line, if that was the only work that was required on the network, potentially that could be done, I don't know. However, you need the equivalent of a Craigdow substation because you need to tie in the wind farm connections and you need to bring in the Tainault to Inverarnan 132 line into that substation in order to create the capacity. So it's not serving a purpose just to connect option 3B or 3A, it's actually serving a purpose to connect in other existing infrastructure.
But the circuits Tainault, you're not increasing the capacity on, are you?
That's why we have a substation to change it from 275 to 132. And that allows the flow of electricity from the 132 to then be exported at 275.
But it seems to me that the current 132 network from Inverarnan switching station going to Tainault, and I appreciate you've taken it out going down to Crossegg, is in a sense being retained. I accept the concept that you need a substation to move up from the 132 to 275 at some point on this line. But that cost is not shown in the cost comparisons that you've already done, is it? Essentially, this is the cost of the Craigdow substation. Is that included within the... Because I don't understand how you get to your linear cost.
The cost of the Craigdow substation is not included in the comparison because we have assumed that the Craigdow substation is required in all scenarios. In order for us to make option 3, alternative 3A, B and 4A and B work and integrate into our network, we have made some assumptions as to how we could do that. That involves retaining the Craigdow substation proposal, or consented substation. Therefore, there is no change. However, it's the overhead line infrastructure that we've had to make the modifications to, and that's what's included in our comparison.
It seems to me, therefore, that you're comparing apples and pears here.
I don't believe so.
I mean, sir, this gets to the nub of the issue, and this is why the additional information and clarification and revised costs were mentioned at the start of this section of inquiry, so that we are comparing apples with apples insofar as it's possible to do so. I mean, Dr. Ford clearly has a different position, different understanding based on limitations, shall we say, in his ability to understand the network. But speaking personally from the applicant's point of view, we've probably bottomed out this issue as far as we can.
I think what I'll do, because otherwise, we may never fully understand each other. It's hard to do orally. I'm going to go away, look at all the written submissions. I'm not asking for any more, please. I'll look at what I've got before me. If I'm still not clear, then I might ask for further written submissions. But, I need to sit in a darkened room and get my head around it as a non-engineer. But if I'm in any doubt, then I will come back to you and ask specific points of probably very naive questions, but I will attempt to get my head around it. Otherwise, as I say, we could be here all day. And I'd like to move on to options 4A and B. Same format as before. I guess we'll start with the critique.
Thank you, sir. So, yeah, there's some degree of similarity with 3A and 3B. Obviously, technical limitations aside, they start in the Inverarnan Castle GDL, Garden and Design Landscape, albeit heading off in a slightly different direction. They do bisect the lower section of the special protection area and cross into the national park, and they were identified as key red flag issues from an environmental perspective, and then adding in the wildland consideration as well. I think that's the key issues from an environmental perspective. I would suggest that the technical challenges are very apparent on this route.
Thank you, Mr. Bruce. Moving on to the engineering issues that have been picked up. Both of alternatives 4A and 4B derive the requirement for crossings of other transmission infrastructure, so 132 kV crossings. 4A requires a minimum of 2, and 4B has a minimum of 132 kV crossings, and that has been following our engineering team assessing to see how we could avoid others that potentially would have occurred on the alignments submitted by NMP. Alternative 4A, moving on to the elevations, has a maximum elevation of 541 metres above ordnance data, and 79.6% of the alignment is 200 metres above ordnance data. For 4B, we're 542 metres above ordnance data, and 68.5% of the alignment is above 200 metres of altitude. 4A and 4B both scored red on ground conditions, so considering the angles and the topography that we are operating within. Noted that the maximum slope that we pick up on 4A is 47 degrees. And we also picked up for 4A that 16.2 kilometres of this alignment will go through peat up to 1 metre in depth. For 4B, we have a maximum slope of 46 degrees, and 17 kilometres of that alignment goes through peat up to 1 metre in depth. For comparison, sir, 1.7 kilometres of our proposed overhead line alignment goes through peat up to 1 metre in depth. And only 0.6 of our overall alignment is considered to be on what we class as very difficult slopes, and that's above 30 degrees. I think it is worth highlighting, just generally for alternatives 4A and 4B, we did undertake a visit to areas of this proposal, particularly along Glen, where we're particularly concerned where the overhead lines drop down and follow the route of existing overhead line infrastructure. It is acknowledged we do have a 132 kV overhead line that traverses down into this glen and makes its way back up again. Our concern, however, was that with the topography seen and the steepness of the slopes, establishing the significantly larger footprint of our 275 kV overhead line towers would introduce extremely difficult working conditions, particularly in terms of benching into the slopes, how we would safely operate our equipment on those types of topography, and the challenges of actually lifting the equipment in there and maintaining the safety of our operatives there. That's obviously that consideration is in line with our requirements under the Construction Design and Management Regulations to eliminate and reduce risk where practical. Concluding our assessment, though, of the engineering challenges, 4A required 22 angle towers based on our assessment and had 13.1% of its alignment within 1 kilometre of access tracks. 4B had 25 angle towers and 10% of the alignment within 1 kilometre of existing access tracks. We did also pick up a red score on proximity for this for both of these alternatives, and that's to the Clachan Flats operational wind farm. What we were determining here, that would appear that the alignment was within 3 rotor diameters of the existing wind turbines. The issue that this creates, sir, is that the disruption of the air created by the turbines can effectively cause fatigue on our assets by effectively disrupting them and can lead to their in-service life being reduced. Again, for buildings, we picked up that alternative 4A has 3 properties, not necessarily dwellings, within 100 metres, and 4B has 10 properties within 100 metres of it again.
And comparative costs, of course, can't resist.
So we'll just quote the numbers that we have. So from our alternatives topic paper, sir, we found for 4A, there was a cost of £120.02 million, so a £58.17 million difference. However, on applying our revised calculations to take into account the amendments required, that difference would be £42.36 million. For alternative 4B, we have a cost of £115.97 million, so a difference of 54.12. But applying our recalculation, it is a difference of £38.31 million.
I suppose from a technical point of view first, Dr. Ford, do you want to come back on any of those criticisms?
Yes, I mean, the issues around slope and those kind of issues, obviously. And just thinking ahead, sir, you're obviously going to do your own site visits and things here. I wonder whether it would be useful to you to have a map of the existing infrastructure so that you know where it is, because I think it might be useful for you to visit it. But in general terms, obviously there's a lot of existing infrastructure here. In terms of the Clachan Flats, we put that route by the wind farm following the line rather than coming down into Glen Fine, but actually there's another set of existing infrastructure coming down into Glen Fine, so it's further south than that part of the route that we've said. And realistically, that's an option. I appreciate the applicant's not assessed it quite, don't have a problem with that, but there is an alternative there in terms of the possibilities. So that relates to the wind farm issues. I mean, I do accept that, we have improved the standards in working practice, but to be frank, I would be deeply surprised if in improving the standards, we really can't deliver an overhead line on these routes for technical reasons. I do feel that the engineering challenges can be overcome. They may have impacts. I'm not suggesting that they're going to be easy to overcome, but my view is that they could be overcome. And obviously, as I said earlier on, there's an existing line that was built 15 years ago.
Sorry, how many years ago?
15.
15 or 50?
15. So completed 2007.
Do you want to respond to any of those?
Yeah, it's just to emphasise the impact of the elevations of these lines and the routes proposed. At its highest point, 542 metres, in old numbers, 1,800 feet. The tower on top of that, let's just go with a 55-metre tall tower. That's putting an operative at a height of about 2,000 feet to undertake work on that tower. Now, that's an environment we try to avoid where possible, and when there is safer alternatives and safer routes, not just to get the people there, but to get the materials there. And the maintenance guys would need to go there following a storm when the line's broken, so they would be extremely limited in when they could actually get access to go in there and to repair the line. So we do consider elevation. It's not just about ice loading and impact on the structures, it's about how they can carry out the work safely to maintain the line.
But that must apply to the existing lines as well.
It would do. It doesn't mean to say that in modern standards we try to improve the conditions and our ability to get our network back up and running if and when we do have damage to it.
Ms. Platt, can I ask for your sort of landscape-related comments? I don't know the answer to this, but your advice, certainly the eastern end of these options, are we getting into more kind of prime walking territory within the national park, or is that not the case?
Yes, I think that's fairly clear, and certainly moving into the national park, to option 4A, moves for quite a long section within the national park. Option 4B is routed more outside, but to a greater degree within the wildland area. So both move into much more sensitive landscapes, which I've mentioned within my reports would need mitigation, whether there's potential for undergrounding. The route is quite long, and I think my point of view was whether the reduction in effects to the western portions, because there's quite a big advantage to having the route where it is and the reduction of effects, combined with potential for mitigation, potential for undergrounding, whether this becomes a good proposed route. It's a difficult one because there are high sensitivities and a greater degree of promoted routes and a good level of visibility. However, the existing infrastructure does create a change to the natural environment, and it potentially would reduce those effects to some degree. I appreciate that there might not be a chance for replacement of the existing lines, which would be the optimal, so that you could just upgrade. Obviously, the engineering aspects are out with my expertise, but it does offer some potential, and I would be interested in that. But I think it's a challenging route, and I think that the landscape sensitivities to the east would present some difficulties and would need careful micrositing and some careful mitigation.
Thank you. Anything on landscape? Mr. Welfare.
Just a couple of quick points. I welcome Ms. Platt's frank and fair appraisal in terms of the potential difficulties in extending into designated and classified areas. I think this particular series of options extending through a number of highly sensitive landscapes, including a garden design landscape of national importance, it shouldn't be underestimated. I don't quite understand, and I'm not going to go into the points about undergrounding. I think this would be quite challenging from that, but I'm not an engineer either. And I think in terms of the point you made, sir, about whether there is increased recreational amenity in this area, absolutely no question about it. We've got some major summits in this location as well. This is a popular a series of routes into some very remote and valuable pieces of landscape. Just one final bit of clarification as well. I might have mentioned this already, but I think there's been quite to a degree there's been a bit of discussion about the number of receptors. I think it's very important to draw to your attention, sir, that one of the very valuable parts of wildland and remote land and wild landscapes is the fact that they don't contain large numbers of peoples. That was it. That was my lot.
Good. Dr. Ford, do you want to say?
Just a couple of points. In terms of the garden's landscape, my understanding is that the line being built does affect that already, that it's just recently built. They obviously have existing infrastructure in that area as well. And in terms of the general principles of this, I mean, obviously, I think we've signalled it in our rebuttals. The applicant is developing on the skyline in wildland and other protected areas. So that, it's not a black and white principle.
What do you mean by that? A specific example of where they're doing that?
I think they're doing it on the south end of Skye. There's parts where they're undergrounding, but there's parts within the protected areas where they're going overhead.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone says you can't do anything in the wildland, and MPF4 is possibly changing its position in that regard. I won't look at Mr. Kelly because I'm sure he's got a view on that. don't say anything. But in terms of relative... Oh, no. I'm sure you're very, very enthusiastic about this change in stance, but in terms of relative sensitivity, you'll accept that wildland is supposed to be wild and empty.
Yes, although obviously we talked earlier on about quite an amount of human infrastructure, less so on this option than alternative 3.
So there's one other point that Mr. Clark wanted to respond to in relation to the suggestion that, or the possibility that Mr. Platt has identified for the need for mitigation in the most sensitive areas and the challenges that would present operationally elevations.
Yeah, so just for the issues I mentioned earlier about the cable access to the cable corridor, to put cables at high elevation makes it even more challenging to bring in the heavy bits of equipment that would be required to go and address faults, repairs to cables, do inspections of link boxes, etc. An overhead line by its nature tends to run until there's a problem. Cables a bit more high intensity in terms of inspections and maintenance. And to put that at high elevation is again increasing the risk to the operative, and you've got to maintain a safe means of access, and where that can be across firm ground at lower elevations, try and get vehicular access to higher elevations is a lot more challenging. Thank you.
Nothing else on options 4? No. Go to option 5. Very different option. Can we have the applicant's comments on number 5, please?
Yes, sir. So, on alternative route 5, this is the proposal to use a subsea cable from Crossing to Hunterston. The key fundamental element that we have noted with this is that using subsea cable in this element does not give the required uplift onto the system to enable us to export the volume of generation that is required. As such, we have not considered it further as part of this public local inquiry. I would note that we did determine this decision, that it was assessed the use of subsea cable as one of our considerations in our initial needs case, and we set out that decision in paragraphs 5.61 to 5.64 of that document.
Dr. Ford will tell me himself, I'm sure, but I think you were criticised for under-speccing it, or is it technically not possible to provide the capacity that you want or need by going subsea?
So what we noted for the 220 kV cables is that the capacity required there. Apologies, sir. The 220 kV, as part of our initial needs case assessments, we did engage with manufacturers to understand the capacities of the cables that were available in the market at that moment in time. The feedback was for the 220 kV and the 400 kV was that they would not be able to meet the uplift requirements. Again, I may bring in my colleague, Mr. Hill, on this to discuss if required. We did look at an HVDC as a consideration. That would have capacity potential up to 2 gigawatts, is what we're seeing in the market there. It was determined for this that because of the length of cable that was proposed here, it would not be economic to take that forward. HVDC tends to become more of a viable option beyond 50 kilometres. And we did find that even when the subsea cables were assessed as part of the cost-benefit analysis, even when considered standalone or indeed with other combinations of upgrades to the Argyll network, they still did not provide the uplift that we required.
Dr. Ford? Mr. Hill? Dr. Ford?
Yes, I mean, I appreciate in our view, you didn't specify it at a capacity that was capable of delivering the infrastructure. So in some sense, it was a false alternative. I accept that there's a trade-off between the economics of DC and AC subsea cables, and it's to do, confirm or otherwise, please, it's to do with a number of circuits, and it means that the longer the circuit is, the more it favours DC rather than AC. So there is a trade-off point. But I think the general principle is that a line could be specified at sufficient capacity to make the connection. It is technically possible.
What cost, I suppose, do we not know? At great cost?
For the HVDC link, there are substantial costs associated with the converter stations that are required at either end to reconvert your direct current back into the AC current that the main onshore national grid operates within.
You have a comment on that?
I accept that, but I'm not sure personally how big the AC cables are. It's not an area that I've conducted detailed research on myself. But I know that AC cables are also used subsea. I don't see why there's a limitation in terms of the capacity. The tendency seems to be that you put more cables in, is the way I understand it.
So there is obviously a limit to what each cable is able to take, and a limit to how many cables we can put in any given corridor. I think it is worth noting at this point that for the initial needs case, we did actually take forward the 220 kV subsea cable, whilst we acknowledged that it did not provide the uplift that we required, for comparison in that cost-benefit analysis to determine if it perhaps could offer standalone a benefit to the Argyll network versus a more substantial programme of upgrades. However, as part of that CVA, sir, it was determined that the solution that we are currently progressing was the correct one to take forward, and that was underlined in our initial needs case.
Without talking about things that have already been discussed with Ofgem, do you accept that that was they did look at the cost-benefit analysis of doing a, albeit lower capacity, subsea?
Yes, and the critical problem is that it was never done as at the appropriate capacity. That's the shortfall.
That was all. I'm not going to bother asking you what you think about subsea cable, other than that would be the ultimate low-impact solution as far as you're concerned. I'll let to make that assumption fairly safely, I think. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So, yeah, I think that was NMP's representation to the PLI that L&V, landscape and visual effects, were not assessed because subsea cable, the impacts of a subsea cable would be negligible, but that is to ignore the requirements for additional infrastructure that would be required to support that cable at either end. So you need additional substations or switching, converter stations at either end. And it hopefully goes without saying, but installing a subsea cable isn't without environmental impact on its own. The route that was indicated that does run through the South Arran Marine Protection Area, which is obviously of note, and not to say that we couldn't find a workable route, but that would have to ignore the technical limitations and the capacity limitations.
Any other relevant matters before we close? Dr. Ford? Ms. Platt, was there anything that you wanted to say before we close this session?
Just to reiterate the issue of the balance of effects when considering the proposal against any of the alternatives, just looking at the significant effects of the proposal and the potential for them to be balanced against different but other effects against alternatives.
Indeed. Thank you. Anything on this side? No? No? Okay. Thank you all very much. Thanks very much, Ms. Platt. Very helpful. It worked very well, I think. We may be doing more of this technological solution in the future. The more times we do it and the more it works, the more likely we are to do it. So thank you very much. Thank you, everyone else. We'll close this session. We are now just going to have tomorrow the evening session for local people starting at 7 p.m. in here. No need for the conditions session. Thank you very much.